Hi, I'm Dan, and I'm excited to welcome you to the Ultimate CSS Full Course. This course is designed for complete beginners with no coding experience, and by the end, you'll be able to write CSS at a professional level. It's by far the most comprehensive and high-quality course you'll find online, and goes well beyond the standard tutorials you'll see elsewhere on YouTube. My teaching style is not to just talk over code, but instead, I've carefully crafted this course to be a visual masterpiece, with interactive animations, beautiful graphics, and professional editing, making it fun to watch to ensure you remain engaged in order to maximize your learning. I also use the most effective teaching techniques for visual learners, where the course is jam-packed with diagrams, analogies, code annotations, tables, and much more. By far the most useful feature is that every topic ends with a summary card, so that by the end of the course you have a full set of cards consolidating everything you need to know for CSS. Now this course is a direct follow-on from my full HTML course, so if you don't know anything about HTML, you'll need to watch that first. It's appearing in the top right now. If you haven't done my full HTML course, but are confident in the basics and know about HTML tags for text, hyperlinks, images, containers, and semantic elements, you'll be able to follow along just fine. So let's look at the CSS course program. We'll be covering the following topics: an introduction to CSS, CSS text, CSS selectors, the CSS box model, CSS units, CSS functions, Flexbox, CSS grid, responsive design, positioning, shadows and transitions, and CSS frameworks. Each of these topics contains many subtopics, which comprehensively cover everything you need to know to get a solid foundation that will enable you to code CSS at a professional level. Throughout the course, we will continue to work on Quill, the major full-stack project we started in the HTML full course. As a reminder, here is where we got up to at the end of the HTML course, and by the end of this course, we will end up with our design looking like this. And I'm sure you can agree with me, CSS is able to bring our web pages to life. Now, if you didn't join me in my HTML full course, you can download the completed HTML file in the description below, so you can pick up where we left off. You can also learn more about all the features of the Quill project by clicking on the video appearing in the top right now. In addition to the starter HTML file, all the complete HTML and CSS coding files, presentation slides, and summary cards from this video can be downloaded from the description below. So let's kick off the course nice and slow with an introduction to CSS. We'll be discussing what is CSS, the CSS box model, CSS properties, and CSS rules. So first up, what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Cascading is how to style an element when several rules apply. There's a bit of theory to get through to fully understand what this means, which we'll be looking at in a later topic. Style is about the various styles that can be applied to HTML elements. And finally, we have sheets that refer to their own documents which can be linked to HTML files. So what does CSS do? CSS is used to control the presentation and layout of HTML. We've looked at HTML already, which is all about content. CSS is all about the visual styling of the content. And the next section we'll spend a lot of time on is JavaScript. These three languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, are the foundation of front-end web development. Let's take a look at the power of CSS by looking at our Quill application with just HTML. For those of you joining me for the first time, Quill is the major project we are working on inside the bootcamp, and this is where we got up to at the end of the HTML section. You can see it is just the content. At the end of this CSS topic, the Quill homepage will look like this. I'm sure that you can agree with me, it's chalk and cheese, comparing the web page with CSS and without it. Now, an important concept we need to discuss straight away is the CSS box model. CSS views every HTML element as if it has its own invisible box around it. Let's take a look at our Quill application and fill in all of these invisible boxes around the content, starting with the logo in the top left corner. Although if I were to trace the perimeter of the icon and text, it wouldn't be straight. All CSS sees is a box around the edges of the content, in this case the image tag. We then have boxes around the navigation links, which are anchor tags. There is a box around the main heading, which is an H1 element. There is a box around the paragraph text, which is a paragraph element. And then again, we have boxes around these links, which are anchor tags. In addition to content elements, structural elements also have boxes around them, like the navigation semantic element and the section semantic element, as well as the span element. We can easily see these boxes whenever we use DevTools. I'm going to right-click, Inspect. I'm going to click the Inspection tool and go and click on some boxes. Let's start with this heading, the H1. You can see a blue box appears around the content. Same with the paragraph and all the anchor tags. This blue box is the CSX box model in action. Now these invisible boxes will either be block or inline. We have already covered this concept in the HTML section, but it's worth recapping because it is critical to understand it when working with CSS, and it can be a bit confusing when first starting out. All HTML elements are by default either a block or inline element. Let's first look at block elements. Block elements always start on a new line. We can represent block elements like this. Block elements always take up the full width of a page. Some examples of block elements are headings, paragraphs, unordered lists, and list tags. Now let's look at inline elements. Inline elements do not start on a new line, unless they're after a block element. This is because the block element extends the full width, so it pushes the inline element onto a new line. We can represent inline elements like this. Inline elements only occupy the width of their content. Some examples of inline elements we've seen include anchor tags, images, a line break, and input tags. Knowing whether an HTML element is a block or inline element is crucial, as it significantly influences CSS styling and layout. Let's go and update this image and distinguish between the inline elements and the block elements. I'll keep the block elements in red and update the inline elements to be green. The logo is an image tag, which is an inline element, so we need to update that. The anchor tags in the navigation bar are also inline, so we'll update that to green. We also have a set of anchor tags in the hero section, so those also need to be updated. Finally, the span, which is a container element used to style text, is also inline, so that needs to be updated. From the outset of CSS, I want you to get comfortable with thinking in terms of block and inline elements. It will make your CSS journey a lot easier. Let's go and check out some block and inline elements. I'm going to open up DevTools, and I'm going to click the inspector icon. Looking at this paragraph first, we can see the blue box extends the full width of the page, and the paragraph text starts on a new line. This is typical behavior of a block element. If we look at the image over here, you can see the blue box is only extending the width of the content. This is also typical behavior of an inline element. Now looking at these anchor tags here, again, the content of the anchor tag is only extending the width it needs, because it's an inline element. So why then is this learn more appearing on its own line? Shouldn't it be appearing next to get started? We discussed this in the HTML section, and the reason this is happening is because the anchor tags are wrapped by list items, which are block elements. You can see the list item is extending the full width of the page, which is then pushing down the next list item, which extends the full width of the page. And the anchor tag is inside that list item. You can see that in the markup here. We have an anchor tag inside the list element. So just be aware that nesting can influence the behavior you'd expect. You might remember at the start of the HTML section, I used this PowerPoint slide of my top 5 best things on the internet as an analogy to explain HTML. I now want to extend this analogy to show you how CSS can influence styling. The first thing we'll do is identify the block and inline elements. I'll have this key at the top with block elements in red and inline elements in green. The heading is an H1, so it's a block element. The paragraph is also a block element. Over here we have an ordered list, which is a block element, and each list item within the list is also a block element. And finally, the image on the left is an inline element. Now let's add some structural elements. I'm going to convert this to gray because I'm going to be adding more layers on, and it's going to be a bit much to leave it all in color. First, we'll add a div to group together the heading and the paragraph text. And then I'll add a section to group the image and list. Both are block elements, so are in red. You could, of course, use other suitable structural tags. I've just chosen these two to show you can mix the generic div container with semantic elements. I'm going to then add the final element, a span, to wrap the text the funniest things, as we will be styling that text differently to the others in the paragraph. A span is an inline container, so it is in green. So next up, we're going to look at CSS properties. This is how we actually style our HTML. I'm going to split what CSS does for us into 3 overarching categories. The first category is styling we can do to content. This is stuff inside the box. This includes properties like font size, font weight, and background color. It's all stuff within the box. Now, there are a lot more, but let's look at some common content-based properties. And we're going to see this in action on the PowerPoint slide. The first thing we can do is switch up the font family to change how the text looks. Then there's font styling, where we get to play with making text bold or adding an underline. Next, we'll change the font color. Watch as the headings turn blue and the funniest things in the paragraph switches to purple. Quick reminder, we are able to change the color of the funniest things because we have a span we added to wrap this text. We can also change the font size. I've applied this to the heading, so watch as it reduces in size. The final property I will be applying is background color, which I will add to the unordered list. So now that we've had a look at the content, next up is the box. These properties are to do with the box itself. By this, we mean CSS allows you to style box properties with things like width and height, border of the box, and margin, which creates space around the box. Let's see these in action inside PowerPoint. Here's where we left off before. Let's add some borders around the image. You can see it here in green. Next, I'll apply margin below the paragraph text, which creates extra space between the paragraph and the list and image below it. We can also play with the box size, which allows us to modify how much space the box takes up. Watch as the image shrinks in size and the width of the list reduces. The last major category is layout. Layout is about where the boxes go on the page. Properties controlling layout include flexbox, which allows us to place elements in one dimension, along a row or column. Grid, which allows us to place elements in 2 dimensions, in rows and columns. And position, which allows us to specify the precise location of elements. Continuing on from where we left off, watch how we can totally transform the layout with grid. We've essentially created 2 columns. Now, this layout looks fairly terrible, but it showcases the power of CSS to move and rearrange boxes. So let's now look at CSS rules, which is how we go about writing CSS. It all starts with what's known as a selector. Selectors is a topic in itself, which we will be looking at a lot of detail later on. For now, a selector does what it sounds like. It selects the HTML we want to target to apply styling to with CSS. The most simple selector is what we call the element selector, where we just reference the element we want to select and style. In this example, I am selecting all H1s on the web page. Next, we add curly brackets, like this, which will enclose the styling rules. I'm going to add 2 styles that hopefully will be fairly intuitive to understand. But seriously, don't worry about the actual styles for now. We will be covering them all in great detail throughout the CSS section. I'm first going to add a style to change the size of the font, which has the notation font-size. This is known as a CSS property. The property is always followed by a colon. We then give the font size property what size we want it to be. In this case, I want it to be 20 pixels, which I write as 20px. This is called the value, and it always ends with a semicolon. We can apply multiple properties inside these curly brackets. Another example would be changing the color of the H1 element to blue, which I would do like this. It follows the same structure as font size above. The property is color, and the value is blue. Let's now zoom out and get a grasp of some of the terminology we are going to be using in CSS. The combination of a property and its value is called a declaration. Multiple declarations inside the curly brackets is called a declaration block. And this whole setup forms what we call a CSS rule for the H1 element. Before we finish up, I want to set some expectations with CSS. The first point to consider is the size of CSS. There are a lot of properties and values, but CSS is many, many times larger than HTML. You don't need to worry about learning them all. I honestly don't know all of them myself. It's fairly common to always be looking these up on a resource like MDN to remember exactly what the property is and how it works. The second aspect is theory. Mastering CSS theory is key to understanding why elements are styled the way they are. Compared to HTML, CSS requires you to have a deeper theoretical understanding of how things work. The third expectation is that CSS can be fiddly. I say that because getting layouts to look how you intend across all devices can be challenging. Although it may not seem so, it's actually fairly challenging to get a layout to look exactly how you want it to. Beyond just the complexity of how the rules work, you also have to have your CSS cope across different devices, which can be a bit of a pain. So let's finish up by starting to build the summary card for this topic. Introduction to CSS. We looked at CSS properties, which control the styling of HTML elements. We saw how each HTML element has an invisible box around it, and that the boxes are block or inline, which is incredibly important from a CSS perspective. We saw how there were three main categories of CSS styling. The first was the content, what is inside the box. The second was the box itself, like width and height. And the third was where the box goes, like a grid layout. We then spoke about CSS rules. Here is the rule we looked at. We saw a selector is what we use to target an HTML element. We then added curly brackets that contain the styles we are applying. The styling is set by a property, in this example color, and a value, in this case blue. A combination of property and value is called a declaration, and multiple declarations are called a declaration block. Next, we'll dive into how we add styles to our web page by different methods for including CSS. We'll be looking at inline CSS, internal CSS, and external CSS. So first up, let's look at the different methods for including CSS in our HTML document. There are three methods for including CSS. The first one is inline CSS. The second one is internal CSS. And the third one is external CSS. It's important to note that inline and internal CSS are generally not recommended. However, it's essential to go through them as they are methods you should know about. External CSS is considered best practice, and this is the method we'll be using in our Quill project. First, let's take a look at inline CSS. Inline CSS is when styling is applied directly to individual HTML elements. As an example, let's take a look at these H1 tags with the text "Welcome aboard." Inside the heading opening tag, we can introduce a style attribute, which is just an HTML attribute. The style attribute can contain a CSS property and value. In this example, color is the property and blue is the value. You can see that there's just one property here, but you can add multiple properties to the style attribute. Now, using the inline method means that styles have to be duplicated for each element, which is not considered a good practice. The reason is because there are going to be many HTML elements on the page that will have similar styling rules. For example, maybe we want all our text to be blue. That would mean every single text element would need to have this style attribute, with the color property set to blue. Now, first of all, that would be a huge pain to repeat that over and over again. And then imagine if we had to go and update our color, we would need to update the value in possibly hundreds of places. Now in this course, I'm using VS Code as my text editor to write code, and Google Chrome as the browser to render our code. You'll need to download both of these tools to follow along with me, and I've posted links in the description below to download each of them. If this is your first time using a text editor like VS Code, and you want to learn a bit more about what it is, then you can check out the video appearing in the top right now, which gives a more detailed walkthrough. So let's jump into VS Code and see how inline CSS works. Alright, so I've gone ahead and set up two simple HTML documents. The first is index.html. It contains an h1, an h2, a paragraph, and an anchor tag. The anchor tag here is referencing this page, download.html, to download the summary cards from the bootcamp. You can see this page is over here, download.html, and for now it just contains an h1. Both of these HTML files are contained inside a folder called including CSS. So let's go ahead and add the style attribute that we just saw before. I'm going to go inside the h1 and grab the style attribute. Let's add the color property and set its value to blue. And then I'm going to add another property by just hitting space, and let's go get font size. Now, as I'm getting this, I want to show you that there's also smart built-in tools to VS Code for CSS. As I'm typing the property I want, you can see VS Code is suggesting some, and I don't even need to type it perfectly correct. I can continue typing SIZ without a hyphen, and VS Code still knows what I'm talking about. So let's grab this property and set a font size of 40 pixels. I'm going to hit save, and let's check this out in the browser. So you can see in the browser that the h1 is now blue and a fair bit larger because I made the font size 40 pixels. Now, as I mentioned before, if we wanted to apply this style to other elements, like say the h2, I'd have to copy and paste this and add it to the h2. Let's save and refresh. And you can see now the h2 has the exact same styles as the h1. So inline CSS is not a good option. Let's move on to the second method for including CSS, which is internal CSS. Internal CSS works by styling a single HTML document using the style element. Let's see how this works. Here you can see I have a set of head tags. If you recall, the head section contains information that is not displayed on the web page. Things like the title tag and meta tags. Inside the head tags, we can add style tags. And just to highlight, these are tags, not attributes, like we saw previously for the inline CSS. In the style tags, we can add a CSS rule, with the same notation we saw earlier, using a selector like h1, curly brackets, and then adding our declarations. Now, this is an improvement from inline CSS, because now styles can be defined once and will apply throughout the document. The problem is styles have to be duplicated for each page. This method is not recommended because most projects will have many HTML files. So for example, if you had a project with 100 HTML documents, you would need to replicate the CSS rule for the h1 100 times. So we still have the same issue, where we need to create this rule 100 times across each page, and then if we wanted to update anything, we'd have to go and update it 100 times. Let's go and add internal CSS in VS Code. Alright, so I'm back in our index.html file. The first thing I'm going to do is just remove these styles we added before. So inside the head, I'm going to go grab the style tags. So let's first style the h1. I'll select it and add our curly brackets. And I'll give it the same style as before, color blue, and font size 40 pixels. While I'm here, I'm also going to go add another style for our paragraph. To do this, it's typical to add a line break, and then I'll select our tag like before. I'll grab the paragraph element by typing P and add our curly brackets. Let's give it a color of green and a font size of 25 pixels. Now before we jump in the browser, I'm going to go add another paragraph just so you can see how internal CSS works. I'll grab the paragraph tags and I'll just type the text, "The cards are great." So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see our h1 is still blue, being defined by this CSS rule here. And you can also see that every paragraph on the page is now green with a font size of 25 pixels, which is being defined by this CSS rule here. So that is good. We're defining the style we want for our paragraph once, instead of on every single paragraph element like you'd have to do with inline CSS. However, we have a small problem that when we go look at the other page inside our project, download.html, which has an H1, you'll see that no styling is applied. So you can see that this is a problem. The styling we're applying on our index page is not being carried across to other pages. And that's because the CSS rule is being defined only on the index.html page. The styling is not present on this page. Now, this is also not a good solution. It's because we want to be able to set our styles in one location for all our pages, so that it's easier to manage our styling rules. So let's now look at the third method, external CSS. Here, styles are in a separate CSS file and linked to the HTML documents. Let's see how this works by looking at an index.html page. Inside the head tags of the HTML file, we add a self-closing tag called link. The link has two attributes. The first is rel, which defines the role of the linked resource. It specifies the relationship between the HTML document and the linked resource. For CSS, we use the value of stylesheet. There are other values that can be used for rel. For example, the value of icon is used for a favicon, that little icon that appears in the tab of your browser next to the web application. Honestly, I just wanted you to know what they are in the context of CSS. There are other values, but stylesheet is by far the most used value you'll see and use. The other attribute is the href attribute, which we've met before when discussing hyperlinks. The purpose of the href attribute is to reference the location of the CSS file, which will be somewhere inside our working directory. So we will be using a relative URL path. Now, it's common to call your CSS file app.css. So I will do the same here. And you can see our href is referencing this file. In this example, inside the app.css file, we are selecting the h1 element and applying the color property with the value blue. Now, with external CSS, our styles are centrally managed from one file. This is good practice. All we need to do now is that whenever we add a new page is reference the same style sheet by including the link element in the head of the page. For example, the register.html page would have the same link. And so too with the login.html page. All these pages are referencing the same app.css file. So in this method, we create a single file that sets the style for elements, allowing multiple pages to reference a unified style sheet. So let's jump back into VS Code and add a style sheet to our project. I'm first going to go and remove the style tag. I'm then going to go inside our working directory, including CSS, and create a new file by right-clicking and clicking New File. And I'm going to call this app.css. Inside the app.css file, let's first go and add the h1 again. We'll do color blue and font size 50 pixels. I'll then add a paragraph. We'll give it a color of red and a font size of 30 pixels. Now, if we were to open up the HTML file in our browser, we wouldn't see any of these styles being applied. And that's because the app.css file is currently not linked to any pages. So let's go link them now. I'm going to jump into index.html. Now, I generally like my title element to come last in the head, so I'm just going to scoot this down. I'm then going to go grab the link element by typing link, and you'll see VS Code automatically gives me the rel attribute with the value of style sheet, and that's because it's the most commonly one used. Now for href, we need to go grab the app.css file. Now because app.css is on the same level inside this working directory, we can just grab it by typing app.css. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see on our index page, our styles have been applied. Our h1 is blue and 50 pixels, and both our paragraphs are red and 30 pixels. If I head over to the download page, you can see none of the styles are being applied. And that's because we haven't yet linked our central style sheet to the download page. So all I'm going to do is copy this link line of code, head over to download.html, and paste it in the head. I'm also just going to quickly add a paragraph here, so you can see that those styles are also being applied. So let's refresh the page, and you can see the styles are being applied. The blue 50 pixel heading, and the red 30 pixel paragraph text. If I go back, you can see the same styles. So I now have one location where our CSS rules are being applied. So now let's say I wanted to update the color of my H1 from blue to green. I just come here and write green. And if I refresh the page, you can see our heading is now green on the index page and on the download page. So now, as you can imagine, if you had hundreds of pages, they're all going to be linking back to this central file. So that is why external CSS is the way to go. Let's now finish off the summary card for this topic, an introduction to CSS. We looked at the 3 different methods for including CSS. First, we looked at inline CSS, which was achieved using a style attribute inside an HTML tag. This wasn't good practice because you had to duplicate every single style for every single tag. The second method we looked at was internal CSS, where we used style tags inside the head of the HTML and defined a CSS rule. This was also not good practice because in this method we had to replicate the same style tags for multiple pages. We then looked at external CSS by introducing a link tag within the head section of an HTML page that referenced the style sheet. In this example file of index.html, the href attribute links to a CSS named app.css, where our styles are defined. In the app.css file, the color attribute for h1 is set to blue, allowing for consistent styling across the project and centralized management of styles. This method is considered best practice among the 3 discussed, as styles are defined in one central location. Great work! We've now finished an introduction to CSS. Next up, it's time to look at CSS text. In this topic, we'll cover the key aspects of text design, including text styling, spacing, size, font selection, and color, while also beginning to develop a style guide. Let's begin by exploring how to transform the appearance of text through various techniques of text styling. We'll be discussing font weight, text decoration, font style, text transform, and list style. Throughout this topic, we're going to be taking a look at a range of text properties. I've broken these down into 5 categories. The first is styling, the second is spacing, and both of these categories have a mix of a few properties. The third one is family, which is about fonts. The fourth one is color, and the fifth one is size. When it comes to color and size, there is a bit more theory involved that applies throughout CSS. So in this chapter, we're focusing on text styling. The first styling property we're going to look at is font weight. It sets the thickness of text characters. Over here, font-weight is the property, and bold is the value. For all the CSS properties I'm going to introduce, below it I'm going to show the values we can use with some notes. For font weight, although we can use name values like bold or normal, it's more common to use numerical values, which range from 100 to 900 in increments of hundreds. Looking at some important values, 400 is considered normal, 500 is medium thickness, and 700 is bold. Normal, which is 400, is the default weight for most text, whereas 700 is the default for headings. When I say default, what I mean is that if we didn't apply any font weight styling, the default for most text would be 400, and the default for headings is 700. As you increase the font weight value, you make your text look bolder. Let's jump into VS Code and play around with this. Inside VS Code, I'm going to go create a new HTML file. I'm going to click New File over here, select Text File, click Select a Language, search for HTML, and hit Enter. I'll straight away grab the boilerplate code by hitting !Enter. And then I'm going to save the file by hitting Command S. I'm going to go on my desktop and I'm going to create a new folder called Text Styling. I'll save this HTML file in this folder and I'll call the file text-styling. I'm going to grab some placeholder text from my favorite placeholder text generator, Hipster Ipsum. I'm just going to copy this first sentence. I'm just going to paste the text over here for now. I'm going to add an H1 element, cut this, and put it inside the H1. I'll then create an H2, and add this text inside the H2. And then finally, let's add a paragraph tag, and I'll pop that text in there. So without adding any CSS, let's go check out the default font weight. So you can see that our headings look more bold because they have a default weight of 700. And our paragraph has just a normal font weight of 400. So let's go change the font weights of these elements. So let's go and create a new CSS file and connect it to this HTML document. I'm going to hit Command N on my Mac to open a new tab. I'm then going to select a language and search for CSS. I'm then going to immediately save it by hitting Command S, and inside the same text styling folder, I'm going to call it app.css. Let's now go and connect the CSS file to the HTML file, like we saw in the introduction topic. All we do is we go get the link tag. The value style sheet for rel comes pre-populated and is correct for CSS style sheets. And the href is just app.css. Because app.css lives inside the same folder and is on the same level as text styling HTML, we just reference it like this. So let's go and style these now. For the H1, I'm going to give it a font weight of 400. This is actually the default weight for the paragraph, so it's going to look a lot thinner. I'm not going to style the H2 because I want to keep it there as a reference to compare it to the H1. For the paragraph, I'm going to give this a font weight of 700, which was the default weight for a heading. So I've actually swapped the weights for headings and paragraphs. Let's take a look at this in the browser. So you can see our H1 now looks a lot thinner. The default heading thickness was over here at 700. And the paragraph, which looked a lot thinner before, now has a font weight of 700. It's the same as the default H2 paragraph thickness. Now, throughout the CSS section, for any property I introduce, I'm going to provide design guidance. I am pretty proud of adding this to my CSS section, and trust me, it's been a lot of work. Most other courses I've seen don't do this. They'll just show you the properties and move on. But I think without any proper design guidance, it is so confusing to know how to actually use the properties effectively. So let's look at font weight guidance. Typically, headings should be between 500 to 900, while other text should range from 300 to 400. For instance, let's check out this web page. The font weight for the heading is set to 600, and for the paragraph, it's 300. You can see the bolder heading is able to draw your attention, which is the effect we want to see. Let's look at another example. On this web page, the heading font weight is set at 500, and for the paragraph, it's 400. You can see this is another approach with values closer together, but it still works and falls within my suggested range for font weight for heading and other text. In our final example, notice how bold this heading looks. Compared to the earlier examples, this one really stands out. That's because the font weight for the heading is 900, while the paragraph is at 400. The next property we'll look at is text decoration. This property sets decorative lines on text. Text-decoration is the property, and in this example, underline is the value. It's called the line value, as we're going to be adding other values soon, so we need to distinguish it from the other ones. Line values include line through, underline, overline, and none. The value none is the default for most elements, which means most elements do not have any text decoration. However, underline is the default for anchor elements. We've seen this already, where the hyperlinks we've created always have an underline by default. We can also give our text decoration a color. So for example, blue, which is the color value. This value is simply added by putting a space after the line value. Color values can be named, hex, or RGB. Named colors are ones we've worked with so far, like green, blue, and yellow. There are other formats of color, like hex and RGB. Don't worry about colors at all for now. We're going to be discussing this later on in this topic. And for now, we're just going to use the simple named colors. We can also add a style of the line, like dotted. And this is the style value. Other style values include double, dotted, wavy, solid, and dashed. If you don't specify a style value, and just made this example underline and blue, the default value will be solid. And we've seen this in anchor tags as well. Let's jump to VS Code and play around with this. I'm back in our text styling HTML file. For this demonstration, I also want to add an anchor tag. So I'm just going to copy some of this text and remove it from the paragraph and add an anchor tag with that text. For now, the href value really doesn't matter. I'm just going to point it to Google. Back in the app.css file, I'm going to remove these styles we added before. For the h1, let's go grab the text decoration property. We'll make the line value underline. Let's give it a color of red, and let's make it wavy. For the h2, I'll grab text decoration. Let's give it a line value of line through, a color of green, and a style of dashed. For the paragraph, we'll get text decoration again. We'll give it a line value of overline, a color of blue, and this time I'm actually going to leave off the style value to demonstrate that by default this line will be solid. That is, a blue overline will appear that isn't styled in any fancy way, like being dashed or wavy. For the anchor tag, I'm going to grab text decoration, and this time I'm just going to set the value to none. I want to remove the default underline that appears there. Let's take a look at this in the browser. Alright, we can see some fairly crazy stuff going on here. The h1 has an underline, so it's under the text. It's red, and you can see it's wavy. For the h2, the line is going through the text because of the line through value. It's green, and you can see the style of the line is dashed. For the paragraph, it's an overline, so it appears above the text, and it's blue. And because I left off a style value, it defaults to just a solid line. There's no particular styling, like being wavy or dashed. And for the anchor tag, you can see there's no longer an underline here. We removed it with the CSS rule text decoration none. If I delete this and save and refresh, you can see by default we've got the underline back on our anchor tag. So let's now take a look at some text decoration guidance. We should always remove underline from anchor tags and very rarely use text decoration. On this web page, you'll notice the anchor tags here have no text decoration. And I'd highly recommend that instead of using text decoration to style text, it's a much better idea to style your text like you see it here, where we're styling with weight and color instead. I generally recommend steering clear of using text decoration for styling purposes, except for removing it from anchor text. Text decoration reminds me a lot of Internet Explorer. There's a ton of memes about how the whole purpose of Internet Explorer is just to download Chrome, like this one over here. It's the same with text decoration. Its main purpose is just to remove itself. The next property we're looking at is font style. This property sets the style of a font. Over here, font-style is the property, and in this example, italic is the value. The values we can use are normal, italic, oblique, and oblique at a specific angle, like oblique 10 degrees. The default value for font style is normal, meaning by default, no special font styling is applied to our HTML elements. Let's go play around with this in VS Code. I'm back inside our textstyling.html file. I'm going to head over to the CSS file, and I'm going to delete all the styling from before. For the h1, we'll grab the font style property and set it to italic. For the h2, we'll grab the font style property and set that to oblique. And for the paragraph, I'll grab the font style property and I'll set this to oblique with an angle of 30 degrees. Let's check this out in the browser. So looking at the browser, you can see the h1 is now in italic. The text slants to the right. But the h2, which is set to oblique, and the paragraph, which is set to oblique with an angle, kind of looks the same. And the truth is, the visual differences between italic and oblique can be subtle and may not even be noticeable in many fonts. So what is the difference between italic and oblique? Italic is a purpose-built font. For example, in Microsoft Word, you can select your font to be italic, which is actually selecting a specific variation of the font. Whereas oblique will take the regular font and just slants it to the right. It's not a purpose-built font. It's applying rules to an existing regular font. And that's why these basically look the same. The differences can be subtle. And to be honest, I really wouldn't worry about any of this. The nuanced differences between them concerns the print industry a lot more than web developers. So if you ever want to use this property, I suggest just using italic. Let's now take a look at some font style guidance. Font style can sometimes be useful to draw attention. In this example, you can see the words in half is in italic, to emphasize the fact you can cut your publishing time in half. Once again, personally, I prefer using weight and color to draw attention, and I suggest you also do the same. Next up, we're going to look at text transform. This property sets the capitalization of text. Over here, we can see text-transform is the property, and uppercase is the value. The values for this property include none, uppercase, lowercase, and capitalize. None is the default value, which means text will just appear exactly how you typed it in your HTML document. Uppercase turns all letters into uppercase, lowercase turns all letters into lowercase, and capitalize means the first letter of each word is capitalized. Let's go play around with this in VS Code. I'm back inside our text styling HTML file and its corresponding style sheet. For the H1, I'm going to remove this, add text transform, and let's add the value uppercase. For the heading 2, I'll remove this and go grab the text transform property and set it to lowercase. And for the paragraph, let's remove this, grab the text transform property, and set the value to capitalize. Now, just before we look at this in the browser, I want to go put a capital in our H2, just so you can properly see the effect of setting it all to lowercase. So let's now check this out in the browser. You can see with our heading 1, every single letter is now in uppercase. With our H2, every single letter is now lowercase. And with the paragraph, the first letter of every word is capitalized. Let's look now at text transform guidance. It's best to stick with sentence case. Sentence case means the first letter of the first word in a sentence is uppercase. So this is just achieved by typing it that way in your HTML, instead of applying the text transform property. In this example, you can see sentence case being used for both the heading and paragraph, where the first letter of the first word in a sentence is capitalized. The T in the, for the recruitment software your candidates and team will love, and the J in join, where the rest of the letters in the paragraph are all lowercase. What you will see is bloggers, edgy brands, and studios will sometimes use uppercase to create a larger visual impact and appear more daring. Here's a studio example where everything in the heading is in uppercase, which creates a huge visual impact. However, for most applications you're likely going to be working on, sticking with sentence case is usually the safer choice. The last property we will look at is list style. As the name suggests, list style sets the style of a list. Here we can see list-style, which is the property, and in this example, disk is the value. The values we can have include none, disk, circle, square, and decimal. Disk is the default for unordered lists. As you've seen, the bullets are always a solid black fill, or disk. Decimal is the default for ordered lists, which are integers that increment by 1 for each list item. Let's go play around in VS Code. I'm back inside the text styling HTML file. Inside the body, I'm going to go create an unordered list. I'll add 3 list items by typing li times 3. And I'm just going to cut this text and remove the elements. And I'll also get rid of the anchor tag. We don't need it anymore. Let's head to app CSS. I'm going to delete all those CSS rules. Let's go and change the list style of the unordered list. I'll grab the unordered list by typing ul. We'll get the list style property by typing list style. We know by default it's disk, so let's change it to square. Let's check this out in the browser. So you can see now that our bullet points are no longer a circle fill, they're a black square. Let's change them to circle to see what that looks like. And now they become a circle with no fill and a black border. The last one I want to show you is changing it to none. This removes the bullet points entirely. So let's look at some list style guidance. We should always set list style to none when they are used for structural purposes. This is going to be the most common use case you are going to have for the list style property, simply using it to remove the default behavior, similar to how we use text decoration to remove the underline from anchor tags. In this example, this navigation bar is built with an unordered list with list styling removed. The unordered list is being used here for structural purposes, to nicely group the menu items together. So let's finish up by building a summary card for this chapter, text styling. We first looked at font weight. The CSS property looked like this, and the values ranged from 100 to 900 in increments of hundreds. The default values include 400 for most text and 700 for headings. And the design guidance is that headings should be 500 to 900 and other text 300 to 400. We looked at font style, where the CSS property looked like this, and the values include normal, italic, oblique, and oblique with an angle. And we saw that normal was the default property. The design guidance for font style was avoid using. For list style, the CSS property looks like this, and we saw there were 5 values: none, disk, circle, square, and decimal. Disk is the default value for unordered lists, and decimal is the default value for ordered lists. The design guidance we saw was that we should remove list styling. We also saw text decoration, where the CSS property looks like this, and there were 3 values. The first was the line value, then the color value, and then the style value. Line values include none, line through, underline, and overline, where none is the default property. For color values, you can use name colors, like we've done here with blue, or RGB or hex values, which we'll be talking about soon. And for the style value, values include double, solid, dotted, dashed, and wavy. For the design guidance, we saw we should remove underline from anchor tags. The last property we looked at was text transform, and it looks like this, where there are 4 values: none, uppercase, lowercase, and capitalize, where none was the default value. The design guidance was use sentence case in HTML. Okay, so it's time to start adding CSS to the major Quill project we've been working on. Let's have a look at where we got up to at the end of the HTML section. I'm just going to scroll down the page so you can see all the content. By the end of the CSS section, our web page will look like this. And as you can see, CSS really adds visual identity to the page. So let's jump into VS Code and take a look where we got up to in the HTML section. So here's our Quill project. We mainly worked on the index.html file, and this is the document we'll be styling with CSS. We also created a placeholder login page and a placeholder register page, as well as the create journal form. And then we also have a series of images, both PNGs and SVGs, that are being used on the index page. Now, if this is your first time joining me, I provided a link in the description below where you can download these files. And if you don't know anything about HTML, you're better off taking the HTML course first, because to properly work with CSS, you do need a solid understanding in HTML. You can take my full HTML course by clicking the link appearing in the top right now. Alright, so the first thing we need to do before we get started is add a style sheet and connect it to the index.html file. To do that, I'm going to come over here into our working directory, click New File, and create a new CSS file called app.css. Now, in order for the styles to apply to our index page, we need to link it. I generally like linking my style sheet above the title. I'll grab the link attribute. The rel style sheet becomes pre-populated, and the value style sheet is correct. And the href is going to point to our style sheet, which is in the same level as our working directory, so it's just app.css. So let's go and add some text styling properties we've just learnt about. We'll start by adding font weight to the homepage. We're going to be setting the headings to a font weight of 700, while other text content and paragraphs will be set to 400. Again, the headings over here will be set to 700, and the paragraph text 400. And at the bottom of the page, this heading will be 700, and the rest of the text will all be 400. So let's jump into VS Code and add this to our project. So let's go and add the font weight for our headings. We'll start with an H1, which will have a font weight of 700, the H2, will also have a font weight of 700. And same with the H3, a font weight of 700. We'll then set our paragraph to have a font weight of 400. And the final element we have on our page is an anchor tag. And we'll set the font weight of that to also be 400. Now, you may be thinking, why am I even setting these weights? The default value for all headings is already 700. And for other text, it's 400. This is just best practice to explicitly set the font weight. It could also be that later on in your project, you want to change this. So it's generally a good idea to always set the font weight, even if at the beginning it's the same as the default. Looking at this in the browser, we see no change, which makes sense because our font weight values, the headings and other text, is the same as the default values. The next property we'll be using is text decoration. All we're going to do is go to our anchor tag over here, grab the text decoration property, and put none as the value. Let's check this out in the browser. You can now see that the underlines on our hyperlinks have been removed. We can see that over here, over here, over here, and these ones over here. That's generally all we do with text decoration. Just remove them from the anchor tags. The next property we'll be discussing is text transform. As we discussed in the design guidance earlier, it's generally best practice to use sentence case. So in fact, we're not going to change anything because I've written my text in sentence case. For example, this paragraph, only the first letter of the first word is uppercase. I have noticed there are a few places that I haven't done this, so I want to correct those now so that everything is consistent. This get started, I'm going to put that in lowercase. The more, I'm going to put that in lowercase. The H2, get started now, I also want to put these letters in lowercase. And the anchor text here, the S in started, I also want to put in lowercase. So this should all be consistent now with everything in sentence case. I'm not going to be applying any text transform property. I've set it how I want to, just by how I've written the HTML. The last text styling property we will be using is list style, in order to remove the bullet points, which are acting as structural units. You can see we have these annoying bullet points, like next to our links over here. And also down the bottom here, with our social media icons, as well as these links. So let's go and remove those now. I'm back inside the Quill project. In the style sheet, I'm going to go grab the unordered list. I'm going to find the list style property, and I'm going to set it to none. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see now those bullet points have been removed for these links, as well as down here on our social media icons. Next up, we'll learn how to control the spacing and alignment of text to improve readability with text spacing. We'll be looking at text align, line height, and letter spacing. So in the previous chapter, I introduced these 5 categories of text properties in CSS, including styling, spacing, family, color, and size. In this chapter, we're going to focus on text spacing, which, like styling, also has a few important properties we need to look at. The first property we're going to discuss is text align. This property specifies the horizontal alignment of text within an element. You can see here, text-align is the property, and in this case, center is the value. There are 4 text align values, which are left, right, center, and justify. The default value is left, meaning if we don't specify any text align property, our HTML elements will align left, which we've seen so far whenever we've written our HTML. It always starts at the left edge of the page. Left align is generally considered easier to read for paragraphs of text. For longer chunks of text, it's advisable to either use text align left or not specify it at all, since it aligns left by default. Center alignment is often used for headings and shorter pieces of text. If you set justify as the value, every line in a paragraph takes up the full width of a containing box. Now, before we go play around with this in VS Code, I want to dive into something incredibly important about text align, and that is the different behavior when applied to block and inline elements. Let's look at a block element first. As you know, with a block element, the box spans the entire width of the page, which allows text align to significantly affect the placement of text. For instance, I have the text here playing with CSS, which is an H1 element. and by default will initially be aligned to the left. As an h1 is a block element, its box will take up the full width of the page. If I apply text align as right, the text will move to the right inside the box. So you can see the text can move right because it is a block element. The box extends the full width of the page. Let's compare this to inline elements. As we know, inline elements only take up the horizontal space that they need. In this example, I have a hyperlink with the text link, which is an anchor element. And as we know, anchor elements only take up the space they need. Because of this, there is no space for the text to move, because the box is only as big as the content itself. So if I try to apply text align right to this element, it won't have any impact. When we first started the CSS topic, I mentioned the importance from the outset of being able to distinguish between block and inline elements in CSS, as styling can be heavily influenced by whether an element you are styling is block or inline. And here is a perfect example of that. Let's now go play around in VS Code. Inside VS Code, I'm going to go create a new HTML and CSS file. I'll start with the HTML file by clicking New File, selecting Text File, click Select a Language, and search for HTML. I'll grab the boilerplate code by hitting !Enter. I'll straight away save the file. On my Mac, I'm clicking Command S. I'll go to the desktop, and I'll create a new folder called Text Spacing. And I'll call this HTML file text-spacing. Let's go add the CSS file. I'll hit Command N to open a new tab. I'll click Select a Language, search CSS, and hit Enter. I'll save this by hitting Command S, and inside the same text spacing folder, I'll save this as app.css. Let's now go and link the CSS file to the HTML file. Inside the head tag, I grab the link element, and as app.css is in the same directory as our HTML file on the same level, we can just reference it with app.css. Alright, for this example, I want to go grab 3 H2s, and I'm just copying in some placeholder text from my favorite tool, Hipster Ipsum. I'm also going to add a paragraph tag with a much chunkier piece of text. And the last element I want to add is an anchor tag. I'll just set the href value as the Google homepage. Now, a really helpful trick I want to show you, which makes working with HTML and CSS more productive, is splitting the Visual Code window into 2. And the way we do that is we grab the other file like this and move it to the right. This now gives us our HTML on the left and our CSS on the right. And we can see both of them at the same time. And sorry, just a minor error I picked up on. This should have been an H3, and this should have been an H4. So let's now go and style these with the text align property. For the H2, I'm going to set text align to be left, which is just the default value, so we shouldn't see any change there. For the H3, I'm going to set the text align value to be center. And for the H4, I'll set the text align value to be right. For the paragraph, I'm going to set the text align value to justify. And for the anchor tag, I'm going to set text align to center. So let's check these out in the browser. So you can see, as expected, our H2 is aligned left, which is just the default value, so there's no visible change here. The H3 has been centered on the page. The H4 is now on the right of the page. The paragraph text is justified, where every line takes up the full width of the page, which means that the spacing in the lines can be different. For example, on this line here, there's much fewer words than elsewhere, so the spacing is much larger. Compared to this line here, where there's a lot of words, the spacing is smaller. And finally, we can see no effect of applying text align center onto our anchor tag, and that's because it's an inline element. If I open up the DevTools by right-clicking Inspect, I can go and select the different elements. For the headings, you can see the invisible box and how it extends the full width of the page, allowing space for the content inside of it to center or move to the right. Whereas for the anchor tag, the box takes up the width of the content, so there is no space for the anchor tag to move. And as we know, an anchor tag is an inline element. Let's now take a look at some text align guidance. Don't justify text. Long blocks of text should be left aligned, and do not center large blocks of text. On this web page, we can see that both the heading and paragraphs are centered, which appears visually attractive. This kind of styling is a common practice, but note that these pieces of text are not long and typically only extend a couple of lines. Let's look at another example. In this case, both the heading and paragraph are aligned left. Aligning the heading and paragraph to the left also presents a neat appearance, and it is especially common to do this when there's an image on the right, like we see here. Centering text with an image beside it wouldn't look so good. However, it's important to note that just because we've aligned left this heading and paragraph doesn't mean we need to do that throughout the page. As you can see below, we have a heading over here that is centered. The next property we're going to look at is line height. Line height sets the height of text and is commonly used to set the distance between multiple lines of text. Here we can see line-height, which is the property. And in this example, it's set to 1.5, which is the value. We can use several types of values for the line height property, such as a unitless value, pixels, percentages, and ems. Unitless is just a number that multiplies the font size and is commonly used for line height. There are other units that you can use, but we will explore these in more detail later on, as units is a topic in itself. Don't worry about these for now, it isn't common to use them for line height anyway. So let's go play around with this in VS Code. So I'm back in our text spacing HTML file. I'll keep this H2 element, but I'm going to get rid of the H3 and H4, as well as the anchor tag. So we're just left with a heading 2 and paragraph. I'm going to pop the app.css file on the right. I'll delete all these styles, and let's grab the H2 and give it a line height of 3. For the paragraph, we'll grab line height and give it a value of 4. So let's check this out in the browser. So let's look at the heading first. If I try select it, you can see the blue box vertically is quite a bit bigger, and that's the impact of line height. However, because it's just one line, we can't really see the effect of spacing between lines. With the paragraph we can. We can see how spaced out each line is. If I make this a smaller value, like 2, you'll see how the lines are much closer together. So the real impact of line height is when we have multiple lines of text. Let's discuss some line height guidance. Headings should always be less than 1.5 and regular text between 1.5 to 2 to improve readability. As you can see here, this heading is assigned a numerical value of 1.2 for line height, which is below 1.5. This creates space between each line, making the heading a bit more readable as it slightly separates the lines of text. However, for smaller text like a paragraph over here, it's recommended to use a line height value between 1.5 and 2. In this example, a numerical value of 1.6 is used to enhance readability. We typically use a larger value of line height for smaller text like paragraphs compared to headings, as paragraphs usually have smaller font size, so require more line height to improve readability on multiple lines. In this example, the line height value for this heading is set to 1.5, which in my opinion is pushing the line height to the limit. You might notice it starts to look a bit odd, as if the lines of text are somewhat disconnected. That's the reason why we shouldn't set the line height value above 1.5 for headings. This is just a demonstration of how text appears when it's on the edge cases, and the lines of text begin to appear excessively spaced out. Moving on to the last spacing property we will look at in this chapter, which is letter spacing. Letter spacing sets the horizontal space between characters. Letter-spacing is the property, and in this example, 8 pixels is the value. Values we can apply to the letter spacing property include pixels, percentages, and ems. Pixels are the most commonly used type of value for letter spacing. We're going to talk about what pixels are soon, but just for now, understand that a pixel is just a small unit, and it's likely something you've heard about before. Keep in mind we will discuss percentages and em values later on. Also note that for letter spacing, there is no unitless value, like there was for line height we saw previously, meaning we can't simply have a number multiplied by the text. Let's go play around with letter spacing in VS Code. I'm back inside our textspacing.html file and corresponding app.css file. I'm going to remove this styling. I'm going to go grab the H2 again. We'll get the letter spacing property, and I'm going to add a value of 10 pixels. Let's check this out in the browser. You can see this looks terrible. Because I've added a positive value, it's creating space between each letter, which makes it really hard to read, as letters are disconnected from one another. Let's now look at some letter spacing guidance. We often apply a small negative pixel value to headings to improve readability. This technique brings letters closer together and is known as tightening. In this example, the heading is set with a negative 3.6 pixel value, making the letters a bit closer to each other, which improves the readability, as larger text like headings will have their letters more spread out, which would look disconnected. So applying a slight negative pixel value tightens the heading and improves the readability. So let's finish out by starting to build the summary card, text spacing and size. We first looked at text align. The CSS property looked like this, and we saw there were 4 values: left, right, center, and justify, where left was the default value. The design guidance we saw was that you can use center, but left align should be used for blocks of text. We then looked at line height, where the CSS property looked like this. The units we can use for the value include unitless, pixels, percentages, and ems. We mentioned we're going to be talking about units in a later topic. And for line height, it's most common to use unitless values, like 1.5 shown above, which multiplies the font size by 1.5. The design guidance we saw was that headings should be less than 1.5, and regular text should have a line height value of 1.5 to 2. The final property we looked at was letter spacing, and it looked like this. Values we can use here include pixels, percentages, and ems. And we noted that you can't use unitless values like you can for line height. For letter spacing, the most common unit to use is pixels. And the design guidance we saw was that small negative values are applied to headings to tighten up the text. Okay, so let's go ahead and add some of the text spacing properties we've just learnt about to the Quill homepage. We'll start off with the CSS property text align. At the top of the page, we've aligned both our heading and paragraph text in the center, which makes sense to do because there's no surrounding assets like an image to cater for. Scrolling down the page, we've also center aligned this heading. However, you can see that for each feature, both the heading and paragraph are aligned left. This looks good because we need to cater for the image on the right. So let's now go and add text align on the Quill project in VS Code. So I'm back inside the Quill project. I have my HTML file here on the left and my CSS file here on the right. We know that for our H1, we want this to be centered. So I'm going to come over here in our CSS, type text align, and set that to center. The H2s are also centered, so I'm going to set text align to center. And the H3s were all aligned left, which is the default value, so I'm not going to touch those. Now, with our paragraph, we have a slight problem, because some of our paragraph text is centered, like in the main hero section below the main heading, where other times it's aligned left, like for each feature in the features section. Now, we're just at the beginning of our CSS journey, so there's not much we can do about this at this point. In the next topic, we're going to be learning about different selectors and the concept of inheritance. And once we've understood that, we'll be able to implement a solution. With the anchor tags, at this point, applying text align center would also have no effect, because an anchor tag is an inline element, so we're not going to apply anything here. So let's check this out in the browser. Okay, so this did have quite an impact on the visual styling. Our main heading is nicely centered now, and our H2s, which are the section headings, like this one over here, and this one over here, are also now centered. Now that we've applied the text align property, let's have a look at applying the line height property. For our headings, we're going to be applying a line height value of 1.2. And for the paragraph text, we're going to be setting a line height value of 1.5. The impact of line height won't be seen for this particular paragraph because it's a single line. However, we will see the effect for other paragraphs down the page. Scrolling down, both the section heading and the features heading will have the same line height of 1.2. And as we saw before, the paragraph text has a value of 1.5. The effect of applying line height on this paragraph will now be seen because there are multiple lines. Let's jump into VS Code and add line height to our project. In the CSS file, for the headings, we have a line height of 1.2. And I'm just going to copy this for the other headings because the value is the same. For the paragraph, we're using a line height with a value of 1.5. And I'm going to do the same for the anchor tag. Although it's not going to be common to have multiple lines on an anchor tag, so this effect won't really be seen. But I'm just adding it for the sake of completeness. So let's check this out in the browser. Alright, we can see for our headings, we have a very slight line height over here when we have multiple lines of text. It's more obvious on paragraphs that span multiple lines, like this one here. The distance between each line has been slightly increased. The final CSS property we're going to be adding in this chapter to the Quill homepage is letter spacing. Across all of our headings, we're going to add a -2 pixel letter spacing value. As a result, each individual letter in the headings will come closer together and improve the readability. Let's go add letter spacing into the project in VS Code. So I'm back inside our project. In the app.css file, in the h1, I'm going to go grab the letter spacing property, and I'm going to set the value to -2 pixels. I'm then going to copy and paste this for heading 2 and heading 3. So let's check this out in the browser. Now, as you can see, this looks fairly awful. The letters are now too close to each other. Later on in this topic, we're going to be changing the font. And when we update the font, this issue will auto-correct itself. So we're just going to have to live with it for now. Now it's time to dive into adjusting the size of text elements by looking at text size. We'll be discussing font size, pixels as a unit, and looking at what a type scale is. So again, here are all the text properties we will be looking at in this topic. So far we've covered text styling and spacing, and it's now time to look at size. It's important to understand that with sizing, there's a bit more theory involved that will apply throughout CSS. We're going to take a look at size in relation to text sizing, but keep in mind that the material we discuss is going to be applicable for other non-text properties we will look at later. So let's talk about font size. This property sets the size of the text. Over here, we can see we have font-size, which is the property, and in this example, 16 pixels, which is the value. Now, when it comes to size units, there are two groups, absolute units and relative units. We're going to be covering units in a lot more detail later on. But here's a quick overview. Let's first look at absolute units. For absolute units, the size is fixed and does not change in relation to parent elements. Examples include pixels, points, inches, centimeters, and millimeters. The pixel is an absolute unit that is commonly used in CSS, and the other units you see here are uncommon. We're not going to use them. Point is a unit that's often used in printing, and inches, centimeters, and millimeters are units used in the real world. Most of the time, except for a few properties, we typically avoid using absolute units because they're static. Web pages are all about dynamic and adaptable designs that can fit different screen sizes and resolutions. Therefore, having a fixed size isn't ideal. So on the flip side, we have relative units. Relative units are where sizes are based on the size of a parent element and adjust proportionally to changes in the parent element. Now, that sentence can seem pretty confusing. The best way I can explain what this means is with this balloon. This balloon has an elastic band wrapped around it. I'm going to call the balloon the parent. It's the thing we're going to inflate. And the elastic band is the child. The size of the elastic band is dependent on the size of the balloon. So if we blew this balloon up, not only does the balloon expand, but the elastic band expands as well. So we can think about this with sizing of HTML elements, that when a parent is a certain size, the child will be a proportion of that size. Just like the elastic band going around the balloon is directly influenced by the size of the balloon. Examples of relative units are percentages, ems, rems, vh, and vw. They're great for web development because they help elements resize according to the parent's container's dimensions, giving flexibility across layouts and screen sizes. This is just a very basic introduction. Don't worry at all about these right now. I just wanted to provide a very soft introduction to them, and as I mentioned, we're going to spend an entire topic discussing them. For now, we're just going to be using the pixel. So let's discuss pixels in more detail. A pixel is a single point of light on a digital display. Here is a screen showing a pixel. It's essentially a tiny dot of color on the screen. So how big is a pixel? A CSS pixel has a length of 1/96 inches, or 0.0104 inch. In a nutshell, a pixel is small. So our pixel over here has a length of 0.0104 inches. If we applied the CSS rule font size as 10 pixels, it would mean that the size of the font would be 10 times this 1 pixel, which would be 0.104 inch. Now I need to add a big disclaimer at this point. The concept of pixel size is actually a bit more complicated than this, because in reality, different devices have different screen sizes and resolutions. At this point, do not worry about this fact. It is something we're going to be discussing a lot more in a later topic, and going into detail now would honestly just confuse you and be counterproductive. So let's now talk about some font size guidance. It's recommended that regular text should be 16 to 32 pixels, and headings can be greater than 60 pixels. Let's look at this web page here. The main heading has a font size of 72 pixels. It stands out nicely from the rest of the text. The paragraph text here is 18 pixels, fitting nicely between the 16 to 32 pixel range. Then we've got an anchor tag, which is 16 pixels, and a smaller anchor tag up here, which is 14 pixels. Scrolling down the page, we have a smaller heading here, which is 48 pixels, and an even smaller heading here, which is 24 pixels. As you can see, while some headings can exceed 60 pixels and be quite large, there is also scope to use smaller values less than 60 for smaller headings. Over here we have some paragraph text, which is set at 16 pixels, slightly smaller than the other paragraph text we looked at before. Let's look at another example. The heading here has a font size of 75 pixels, which is really eye-catching and big. The paragraph text is 28 pixels. What I want to highlight is that you've got some flexibility when it comes to choosing font sizes. There is no hard and fast rule that a heading or paragraph must be a specific font size. However, they should fall within the ranges I've provided. So let's talk about how we can help narrow down our choices for font sizing. You should use a type scale, which provides a structured hierarchy of font sizes to create visual consistency and limit choices. This is a fantastic tool, typescale.com. I've put a link in the description below and I'm going to show you how it works. Over here on the left, we have criteria. The first is the body size. It's the base value that all our text sizes will be calculated from. Just leave this at 16. Scale is the factor we're multiplying our body size to give us a range of other sizes. You can see that there are a range of different scales we can select, like 1.2, 1.250, etc. These names, minor third, major third, perfect fourth, etc., actually come from music theory. You don't really need to worry about the names, focus more on the numbers. Just to play around, I'm going to go select perfect fourth. You can see over here, it outputs us a range of different sizes that scale according to this scale factor. There's other criteria we can play with, like the font. For example, we're going to be using poppers, so I can change that. I can change the weight, line weight, letter spacing, colors, etc. On the far right here, if I expand this window, you can see what a typical web page would look like using this body size with this scale factor. So you can also play around here. In our Quill project, we're going to be using a major third, which is a scale factor of 1.25. We start with a base of 16 pixels. For each value, I'm going to put some sample text so you can see what it looks like. 16 pixels is our base unit. So we then multiply that by 1.25, which gives us a value of 20 pixels. This is then repeated several times, where we get 24 pixels, 32 pixels, 40 pixels, 48 pixels, and 62 pixels. Now I am slightly rounding these numbers to make them a bit more user-friendly. So if you were to use the Typescale tool and apply major third, your numbers would look a little bit different. I can also get smaller values by dividing by 1.25, which gives me 12 pixels. Next, we assign these specific sizes to HTML text elements. Starting at the top, I'll assign 62 pixels to an H1, 48 pixels to an H2, 40 pixels to an H3, and if we do need them later, 32 pixels to an H4, and 24 pixels to an H5. I've skipped over H6 as we don't need to go down that far. I'll assign 20 pixels to our paragraph, and 16 pixels will be our anchor tags. I'm also going to introduce small, which will be used for even smaller text, setting it at 12 pixels. Now note, this is not an HTML element like the others above it, but it's our own defined class, which we will be discussing in the next topic. Now, we could make our paragraph and anchor tags the same size, but I've chosen to keep the anchor tags slightly smaller. Hopefully you can see using a type scale helps provide a structure for helping you select font size. Now, of course, you have complete freedom to choose whatever values you like, and it is sometimes helpful to use a type scale and adapt the values for your own specific needs. So let's finish building our summary card, text spacing and size. We looked at the font size property, which look like this. Values you can use include pixels and rems, where pixels are an absolute value and rems are a relative value. We'll just be using pixels for now, and we have a whole topic dedicated to units later on in the course. The design guidance we saw was that regular text should be 16 pixels to 32 pixels, and headings can be greater than 60 pixels. We also looked at what a type scale was, where we start with the base unit, like 16 pixels, and then apply a scaling factor like 1.25 to give us the next value up, in this case 20 pixels. We then continued this to get higher values. And then from these values, we attributed a particular HTML element. So let's go ahead and add some different font sizes to our Quill project. These are the different font sizes we defined earlier. We used the type scale to establish different font sizes for different elements. We're now going to be using these values inside our Quill project. Our heading 1 has a value of 62 pixels. Our paragraph, 20 pixels. And our anchor tags are all 16 pixels. Scrolling down the page, our H2 is sized at 48 pixels. Our H3 is set at 40 pixels. And just like before, the paragraph is 20 pixels. Moving down to the bottom of the page, this heading 2 also has a value of 48 pixels. The anchor tag has the same value as the other ones at 16 pixels. And the anchor tags down here is also 16 pixels. We also have this very small piece of text right at the bottom here. This is 12 pixels. It's that small value we saw, and we'll be defining later in the next topic. So let's jump into VS Code and add all our font sizing. So I'm back inside the Quill project. I'm going to head to the app.css file, and we can start adding our different font sizing. Starting with the H1, I'm going to go grab font size and add the value of 62 pixels. For the H2, the font size value was 48 pixels. For the H3, the font size value was 40 pixels. Now, although we don't have an H4 or H5 yet, I am going to add them in case we want to use them later. So I'll grab H4, and this at a font size of 32 pixels. I'm also going to apply the other properties we've consistently applied to our headings: the font weight, line height, and letter spacing. For the H5, the font size was 24 pixels, and I'm just going to paste above those same settings. For our paragraph element, the font size was 20 pixels, and for our anchor tag, the font size was 16 pixels. Let's go check this out in the browser. So you can see adding font size makes a huge difference to our design. The H1 is looking nice and big here. The paragraph text is more readable. And the feature section pops a bit more, with a larger heading here and larger heading here. Scrolling down to the call to action section, the Get Started Now is also nice and big. One major change that has also happened since we've now made our text a lot larger is that the letter spacing value of -2 pixels actually looks good, where the text is no longer too cramped. While the letters are still a bit on top of each other, it does look a lot better, and it will only improve when we add our own font to the Quill project soon. As you can see, font size is really important. It makes a huge visual difference to your webpage. In the next chapter, we'll explore how to change the overall look and feel of your text by looking at text font. We'll be looking at typefaces, font family, and Google Fonts. So far, we've looked at styling, spacing, and size. In this chapter, we will be discussing font family. Let's start by talking about a typeface. A typeface is just a fancy word for a specific font. A font features characters with consistent visual characteristics. Now, typefaces or fonts are organized into groups. The first group we have is serif. Serif fonts have extra details on the end of a stroke, which you can see on this font over here at the bottom of the T. A classic example of a serif font is Times. Next, we have sans serif. These fonts are known for their straight ends and are much cleaner. And they don't have those extra details like a serif font. Arial is an example of a sans serif font. Next up, we have monospace fonts. In this font, letters are the same width. This means each character takes up equal space, like you see over here. Courier New is a good example of a monospace font. The next group are cursive fonts. Cursive fonts have joining strokes or mimic handwriting. Comic Sans MS is an example of a cursive font. The final group are display fonts. They are designed to be attention-grabbing and more artistic. Impact is a popular display font. Let's now explore each of these typeface groups and see how they're used in design. We'll first start with the serif typeface. Serif fonts are all about a classic feel, used by brands to communicate luxury and reliability. Here's a great example. Patch is a more high-end plant company. I've previously complained about this company, as they sell grossly overpriced plants because they have cute names like Susie and Big Ken. But I have to hand it to these guys, their branding is pretty slick. When you look at their heading, it's just got that vibe of being a bit more classy. Serif typefaces are a go-to for high-end products. Next up, we've got the sans serif typeface. It's a modern and clean feel used by brands to communicate simplicity and clarity. Take a look at this heading and paragraph text. It's clean and straightforward. Sans serif fonts are a favorite among tech companies. Next is the monospace typeface. Monospace typeface has a technical feel used by brands to communicate accuracy and precision. This is a good example of using a monospace font. It's typically picked for very technical products. This company is quite techy, so they've used monospace to really drive home the vibe of scientific precision and accuracy. Moving on to cursive typeface. This one's all about creating a personal feel, which is used to connect with people on a more emotional level. The text here is cursive, which is super popular for things like weddings and blogs. It brings that personal touch used to evoke heartfelt emotions for an event like a wedding. Finally, we have the display typeface. It's a creative feel used by brands to communicate playfulness and rule breaking. This company sells CBD gummies, so it's a bit more of an edgy product. So a display font is a good choice. Display fonts are commonly used by fun brands, bringing a bold and lively vibe to the table. Alright, so let's look at the font family CSS property. Font family in CSS sets a prioritized list of font names, typefaces, or font categories. Let's take a look at this. On the left, we have the CSS property, which is font-family. In our example, the value Tahoma is used, which is a sans serif font. And this is our first choice. This is then followed by a font group, sans serif, which is our fallback option. So why do we need a fallback option? The reason behind this is that fonts will only display in your browser if they are installed on your machine. So for example, the font Tahoma is installed on 99.9% of Windows machines. However, on Mac, it is installed on only 91.7%. There's a chance that if you're viewing a web page on a Mac and Tahoma isn't installed, it won't show up. That's where our fallback comes into play. The fallback is set as a generic font group, like sans serif, which ensures a font group that you do want will be found and displayed. So what sans serif font will be applied? This also depends on your operating system. On a Mac, the default sans serif font is Helvetica, while on a Windows it's Arial. Let's look at an opposite example. Futura is on 1.3% of Windows and 94.4% on Mac. So you can see the fallback option is really important for ensuring font visibility across different platforms. Now you can add more fonts to the comma-separated prioritized list, but you should always end with a font group as opposed to a specific font to ensure a backup font from a group you prefer will always be selected. At this point, I also want you to note that when we provide a single font value, it's in commas, whereas a font group is not. So let's jump into VS Code and check this out. Alright, so I've set up a new folder called font-family, and inside it I have an index.html file where I've grabbed the boilerplate, and I've also linked a style sheet called app.css, which is currently empty. So inside index.html, I'm just going to go add an h1, and let's just give it the text, "This is a heading." So let's head over to app.css. I'm going to select the h1. I'll grab the font family property and make my first choice impact. Now, because I'm on a Mac, there's a 95% chance this font is installed on my device. I'll then go give a backup font of sans serif. And just a reminder, the specific fonts that you select should be in commas, whereas a font group is not. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see that our heading is looking very different to how it usually looks. Just a reminder of what it usually looks like. I'm going to comment out this h1, save and refresh. And you can see this is the default font you're used to seeing. I'm just going to go back and uncomment this. So the impact font is being applied, and we can actually confirm this in DevTools. I'll right-click Inspect. Now in the HTML section of the course, we spent a lot of time on the Elements tab, specifically on the left here, where it showed us the full markup of the page. In the CSS section, we're going to be spending a lot of time on the right here, as this shows all the CSS rules that are applied to the page. If I grab the inspection tool and select the h1, you can see over here h1 with the font family impact being applied and the backup font sans serif. And in fact, I can turn this off like this by unticking this box, which will return the heading to its default font style. Now, if I head over to Computed, I'm going to scroll to the bottom, and you can see under Rendered Fonts, it says Family Name Impact, and this confirms the impact font is being applied. Let's check out what happens when I update the font to another family called Seagull UI. This font family has a 0% chance of being installed on my Mac. So I'll save this and refresh the page. So if we look again at rendered fonts, you can see the font family name is Helvetica, and that's being applied because my first preference font is not available in my system. So the font being applied is from the backup sans serif group, and the default backup font for sans serif on a Mac is Helvetica. Now this font isn't all that ugly, but if I go back to Styles and now remove this property and go back to Computed, now the font family being applied is Times, which is just the default font of the browser, which isn't great, so it's really important to have a backup font group to avoid this happening. So let's now look at some font guidance. The key takeaway is to play it safe and pick a popular sans serif font. Sans serif fonts are a popular choice, especially for tech-based applications that you're likely going to be working on. Let me show you some popular fonts that I would like to recommend. First up is Roboto, and on the right is a sample of how it looks. Open Sans is also very popular and looks super clean. Another classic option is Montserrat. Another option is Poppins, which is actually one of my favorite fonts, and we'll be using it in our Quill project. And finally, Inter is another popular option. These are just a few examples of some great sans serif fonts to consider. Now, in your projects, it's recommended to select 1 or 2 fonts, but no more. In this example, only one font is being used, which is Inter. The page looks nice, clean, and unified. Let's look at another example. Here the heading uses Poppins, and then for smaller elements like subheadings, the font Rubik is used. Mixing 2 fonts like this can really make your design pop with nice contrast. But remember, do not go more than 2. Any more, and your design starts to feel a bit overwhelming, and you lose that cohesiveness. We'll finish up by talking about Google Fonts. Google Fonts are fonts that are available online and do not rely on the fonts installed on an individual user's device. These fonts live on the web, meaning they are not tied to your device at all, but are in the cloud. Google Fonts are very easy to add to your project, and it is super straightforward. There are just 3 steps. First, you need to find the font you like. Next, you embed the font with a link tag in your HTML. And then the third step is you add the font into your CSS. So let's go see how this works. Alright, so here's Google Fonts. The URL is just fonts.google.com. On the homepage, you're shown a list of fonts that are currently sorted by trending. So you can always come here to get some inspiration of which fonts to choose. You can then sort by other filters like most popular or newest. There's also additional filters over here, where you can filter by serif or sans serif, and other classifications like display, handwriting, which is cursive, or monospace. So let's go search one of the popular sans serif fonts I recommended earlier. Let's look for Inter. So you can see it appears here. So we click on the font. In the top right, we click Get Font, and then Get Embed Code so we can add it to our CSS. Now before we embed it, there's a few criteria options we can select. At the moment, it's going to be importing all font weights from 100 to 900. If you wanted to, you could click one value and select a specific value you want to import. I'm just going to import them all. And you can also change the slant of the font. At the moment, the default is 0, which I'm just going to keep. So my font will just be normal without any slant. Now on the right over here, we have 2 windows. Embed code in the head of your HTML, and CSS class for a variable style. This top part here is what we're going to copy into the head section of our HTML to actually import the font. And this window over here is just showing us an example of how to use the font in CSS by declaring the font family property with the font family name Inter and backup sans serif font. So let's copy this code and add it to our HTML. Now it's best practice to add this snippet of code before the link to our own style sheet. So I'm just going to paste it over here. This order ensures that font styles are loaded before our own custom styles, so the fonts that we're importing will load in app.css without any issues. Now this does look a little bit intimidating, so let's just briefly talk about what these different lines are doing. These first 2 lines are just for optimization purposes, and in theory you don't actually need them, but it's best to leave them there just to ensure the fonts load in quickly. This third line is actually importing the font itself. You can see over here family equals Inter, and it's importing the weight 100 to 900. So let's go add this font in our CSS file. For the font family, I'm now going to replace this font we added earlier with Inter. I'm also just going to add an H2 below so we can have a point of comparison to the default font in the browser. I'll just type default font. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see the Inter font has successfully been imported. And again, we can confirm that by opening up DevTools, selecting the element, going to the Computed tab, and seeing the family name Inter. And you can see this font is just way nicer than the default Times font that comes in our browser. So let's finish up by starting to build out the next summary card, font family and color. We looked at what a typeface is. We saw that there were 5 primary groups of fonts. The first was a serif font. The next was a sans serif font. Then a monospace font, a cursive font, and a display font. We then looked at the CSS font family property, which looked like this. Font-family with a comma-separated list of fonts where descending values were backups. And we always ended with a font family group, like sans serif, which was the final backup. The font guidance we looked at was use a popular sans serif font. So let's go ahead and add Google Fonts to our Quill project. I've decided for this project, we're just going to be using a single font throughout the application. So our headings, paragraphs, anchor tags, and all other text will be in the font Poppins, which is one of my favorite sans serif typefaces. So let's head over to Google Fonts and grab the code to embed in our project. So I'm on the Google Fonts homepage, fonts.google.com. So I'm going to go into the search bar and look for Poppins. I'll click it over here. I'll click Get Font. I'll click Get Embed Code. I'm not going to play around with any of this criteria. I'm just going to import all the different fonts in case we decide later in our project we want to use any. On the right over here, I'm just going to copy all this code. Alright, so I'm back inside our Quill project on the index.html page. I'm going to go paste in the code we just copied earlier. And I'm going to make sure to do it before my own custom style sheet app.css. I'm now going to head over to app.css, and for each text element, I'm going to add the font family property, set the value to Poppins, and provide a backup font of sans serif. I'm just going to copy this line of code for all my headings, paragraph text, and anchor tag. Alright, so let's check this out in the browser. Alright, so this has made a massive difference. Using a popular sans serif font, like Poppins, really does start bringing the project to life. I also want you to notice how adding that -2 pixel letter spacing was the right decision. Now that we've added the font, you can see that our text has been tightened, and the headings look like a nice cohesive unit. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the huge benefit of using Google Fonts is that they're stored in the cloud, which means that the fonts will always load in, irrespective of what fonts are installed on the user's device. Let's continue by adding visual impact to our text through the use of color. We'll be discussing named colors, color systems, the color property, and color palettes. Alright, we're finally onto our last text property. Now it's time to look at my favorite CSS property, color. Just like size, color is used throughout CSS, so it's really important to get a good understanding of what it is and how it works. So let's first start with named colors. These are the colors we've been working with so far. CSS includes 147 named colors that browsers recognize. An example of a common color we've seen so far is red, and then there'll be some variation, like salmon. We've got yellow, and a variation called khaki. There's blue, with a variation called aquamarine, and we've got green, with a variation called olive. Now, although we have been using these colors so far, these should not be used as they are very limited and not suitable for professional projects. This website, HTML Color Codes, shows you all the HTML named colors. So if you are interested, you can come here and check it out. So before we start looking at the CSS color property, we need to have a look at color systems. Color systems are a structured method for creating different colors using a set of primary colors and rules for mixing them. There are two main color systems. They are subtractive and additive. Let's look at the subtractive color system first. It's commonly used in print and painting, something many of us would have learnt about in school. Let's take the CMY color system as an example. In this system, C stands for cyan, which is that blue color, M for magenta, which is that pinky color, and Y for yellow. This system starts with white, and we apply colored pigments that absorb light. We start with a white canvas and add different colored pigments. The canvas absorbs the light from these paints, and you get black when all the colors are mixed together. Now on the flip side, we have an additive color system. This is commonly used in electronic displays. The primary colors here are red, green, and blue, often abbreviated to RGB, a concept we'll look at soon. In additive color systems, we start with black and emit light at different intensities. Think about it, before your screen is on, it's black, and once it's on, it's emitting light at different intensities. When red, green, and blue are all combined at their maximum intensities, the result is white when all mixed. The additive color system is the complete opposite of the subtractive color system. Now, in the context of CSS, we use an additive color system. It's because our colors are on a digital screen. I now want to go back to pixels, but this time we're going to be talking about color and not size. A pixel on your digital display is made up of red, green, and blue lights with adjustable intensities, which means we can tweak how bright each one shines. Over here I have a digital display, and this square over here represents a pixel. Let's now zoom in on this pixel. what we would see are three panels of light: one red panel, one green panel, and one blue panel. These are the primary colors, red, green, and blue, we mentioned in the additive color system, and we call this RGB for short. RGB values range from 0, which is minimum intensity, to 255, which is maximum intensity. So for red, the intensity can go from 0 to 255, for green, 0 to 255, and for blue, 0 to 255. So for each color, there are 256 possible values, 0 being one of them. So let's go tinker with these values and have a look at an example. Imagine we set R to 152. It's a somewhat muted red. The green value to 116, and the blue value to 249, which is pretty close to the maximum. As a pixel is tiny, our eyes would mix these colors and would get purple. Looking at another example, setting R to 232, green to 202, and blue to 9, from a far distance these colors would mix to yellow. So playing around with different RGB values gives you a whole spectrum of colors. An easy way to see the RGB value of different colors is to go to Google and type in color picker, and you get this widget at the top here. You can use this slider to go across the spectrum of colors, and then you can use your mouse to click a different tint or shade. And each time you click, you get a different RGB value. Now, you can see below here, the first listed color is this thing called hex. So what is that? So let's take a look at RGB and hexadecimal notation. Color values can be represented in either RGB or hexadecimal notation. As a disclaimer, there are other systems, but RGB and hexadecimal are by far the most common. So let's first look at RGB. In CSS, we'd represent an RGB value like this. We'd write RGB, and then inside the brackets, we'd have each value comma separated. The red value first, then the green, then the blue. This RGB value would produce this purple color. Let's now take a look at hexadecimal notation. This same RGB value can be written like this, which is in hexadecimal notation. We start with a hash, and then we have three sets of numbers and characters. In this case, 98, 74, and F9. This would produce the same color purple. Defining a color using the hexadecimal notation is actually more common than using RGB, so we're going to be using it throughout this course. And this notation is used across CSS for specifying colors for text, backgrounds, borders, shadows, and more. Now, you might be thinking, what is this hexadecimal notation? RGB you may have heard of before, but hexadecimal might be completely new to you. So looking back on the Google Color Picker, you can see that we have our RGB value and a corresponding hex value, which starts with the hash symbol and has three sets of letters and numbers. In this case, A1, 6D, and B3. So before we look at the CSS color property, we need to talk about shades of gray. When all three channels of RGB are set to the same value, we get a shade of gray. Let's take a look at this gray color here. It would have an RGB value of 64, 64, 64, and a corresponding hexadecimal value of hash 40, 40, 40, which gives us a dark gray. This gray color here would have an RGB value of 136, 136, 136, with a corresponding hex value of 88, 88, 88. This lighter gray over here would have an RGB value of 192, 192, 192, and a corresponding hex value of C0, C0, C0. Let's have a look at the extremes now. To get black, we set all the RGB values to 0, and in hex notation, all the values are also 0. On the other extreme, we have white. This is when all the RGB values are 255. And in hex notation, all the values are F. So this means we have 256 values of gray to play with. I also just want to show you something you may see sometimes, which is the shorthand for hexadecimal values. You'll see this shorthand when each pair of values in a hex code are the same. Let's take a look at an example. If the first pair is 22, the second pair is AA, and the third pair is 66, this can be shortened to 2A6. So for some of our shades of gray, we can use the shorthand as another way to represent them. For example, for black, each of the 3 sets has the same character of 0, so we can shorten this to 000. For the hex value where there are all 8s, we can also shorten this to 888. And for white, where there's all Fs, we can shorten this to FFF. We can't shorten the 404040 or the C0C0C0 because for each pair, the character has to be the same. 4 and 0 is not the same, and C and 0 is not the same. It only worked for the others because within each pair, the characters were the same. Now the shorthand notation is a neat trick, but it's not something to stress over. Most of the time you'll be using full hexadecimal codes. It's just something I wanted to show you that existed, so that if you ever see 3 characters being used for a hexadecimal code instead of 6, you know why. Let's now take a look at the CSS color property. The color property is used for specifying the color of text. Over here, you can see color is the property, and in this example, the hex code #9874F9 is the value. The values that we can use for color include RGB, hex, RGBA, and HSL. And as I mentioned earlier, hex is by far the most commonly used color system, but I do want you to be aware there are others. Now, the color property is specifically used on text. There are other properties like background color we'll be looking at later in the course, which as the name suggests, define background colors. And color values like the hex code you see on screen are often used throughout other CSS properties, like borders and shadows, CSS properties we will also look at later in the course. So for now, just know that the CSS property color is just for text. So let's jump into VS Code and play around with this. I've gone ahead and set up a new directory called color. Inside it, I have an index.html file where I've grabbed the boilerplate, and I've also linked a style sheet called app.css, which is currently empty. On index.html, let's grab an H1 and just give it the text heading 1. I will just grab a paragraph and give it the text paragraph text. Inside app.css, I'm going to select the H1. I'll grab the color property, and let's start off with an RGB color. I'm just going to pick some random numbers between 0 and 255. So let's make the R 55, the G value 189, and the B value 110. So one of the nice features of VS Code is that it actually gives you a little sample of the color on the left of the property. And if I click on it, I can move around to get different tints and shades, and I can use this swatch to grab different colors. What's also really nice is if I come to the top here and click this, it toggles between different color systems. So let's go grab the hex color code, and I'm just going to change it to a bright green. So let's check this out in the browser. So as you can see, that bright green color has been applied to our H1. And I've just got this paragraph texture as reference to see the default color. And once again, I just want to drive home the message that the color property is only for text. For example, if I go add an input in our HTML, and then try apply the color property to the input, I'll just pick the same color as before, you'll see nothing changes. And that's because the CSS property color only works for text. There are other properties we're going to be looking at later, where we can change the background color of this input and even the border color. And you can actually see when I come into this input and start typing, the input text is green. Let's now look at some color guidance. The guidance I'll be going through now doesn't only apply to text, but as the web application as a whole. Now the rule of thumb is to have at least 2 colors in your color palette, a primary color and a gray color. Let's have a look at an example of a typical color palette. We'll start with the primary color. The first thing we do is choose a base color. In this case, it's this orange. The next thing you'll want to do is add tints. These are lighter shades of our base color and will look something like this. We also want to add shades, which is a darker version of our base color and will look something like this. We then add a gray color. Now the term gray is a bit confusing because it doesn't have to be a gray color. It can be a darker version of a color. So for example, the base gray color could be this dark purple. And again, we go and add tints, which are lighter versions of the gray color, and shades, which are even darker versions of the base gray color. Let's take a look at this color palette in action. primary colors are used to highlight important parts of a page, and tints and shades can be used to create contrast. Here is the color palette we saw before being used on this page. You can see the call to action here, as well as this review icon, are in the primary color. They're the more important components of this page. You'll also notice the background color of the page is a lighter orange. It's the primary tint being used, which creates a nice contrast, but still maintains that consistency with the color palette. Now the gray color, along with its tints and shades, is often used for fonts. You can see this main heading over here is in the gray base color, whereas a less important subheading, like the one over here, is in a gray tint. Also, color is used in images and illustrations for consistency. Taking a look at these company logos here, they're in gray tints and shades. And the main image over here is also in gray tints and shades. So color is used throughout the design for both components and sections. Scrolling down on the page, we have this section over here. You can see over here that the primary color is used in components, whereas the gray color is used in this section as a background. So you can see throughout the design, you can play around with the base primary and gray color, as well as their respective tints and shades to create a clean and unified design. Now, adding a secondary color introduces variety and contrast, often making designs more appealing. Let's go set up a new color palette. For our primary color, we're going to use this blue base color with respective tints and shades. I'm going to add a secondary color of this purple with respective tints and shades. And for the gray color, I'm going to use a more traditional gray with its respective tints and shades. Let's check this color palette out in action. As we've seen before, primary colors are typically used on dominant elements such as buttons, background colors, and more. You'll notice the primary color is being used on icons, section headings, and buttons. And a primary tint is being used as a background. Secondary colors are used to add variety. Scrolling down the page, we have a very similar section, but now they're in the secondary color. We have the section heading and imagery in the secondary color. And again, the background color is using a secondary tint. Now you can also add tertiary colors. Tertiary colors add further variety. Looking at the same page again, we have this orange tertiary color being used as a section heading and in the icon. So let's now take a look at helpful resources which help you select colors. The first resource, which is my favorite, is called OpenColor. It's this first link in Google over here. It basically gives you a gray color, along with tints and shades, as well as common colors you'd use for primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, like red, pink, grape, violet, etc. From here, you can easily select your own base color, like blue 4 or 5, and corresponding tints, like blue 1 and 2, and shades, like blue 7 and 9. This is one of my favorite resources because it really helps limit down color choices for you. The colors chosen here really are spectacular and beautiful, and I would recommend using a resource like this so that you don't feel overwhelmed. Another popular resource is Tailwind Colors. So if I type Tailwind Colors and click on this link, I'm provided with a similar resource like OpenColors, but there's just a few more options. For example, you can see there's quite a few more options of gray colors, like slate, gray, zinc, neutral, etc. And there are a few more colors you can use for primary, secondary, tertiary, etc. It's basically OpenColors with a few more options. Tailwind is a very popular CSS framework we will be discussing later on in the course. If you want a bit more freedom to choose a color palette, a tool like Coolors is really popular. From the homepage, if I click Explore Trending Palettes, you can see that I'm given popular color palettes. So essentially, primary, secondary, tertiary, gray, etc. is selected for me. Now, if I wanted to use this color palette over here, I'd have to generate my own tints and shades. To do that, just head over to Google and search Tints and Shades Generator. I'll click on this first link over here, and all you do is copy the hex code, I'll grab this one, and paste it in here, and click Make Tints and Shades. You can see our base color over here, with shades becoming more intense as I move to the right, and this row is the tints, with the tint becoming more intense as I move to the right. So this is another option, finding a color palette you like and generating your own tints and shades. Now coming up soon, we're going to be adding colors to our Quill project. But before we do that, I'd like to quickly talk about brand guidelines. We'll be discussing this a lot more in the web design module of the Full Stack Bootcamp. Essentially, every product will have brand guidelines. It's usually a very detailed document containing rules about colors, sizing, logos, etc. I'm on the Duolingo brand guidelines. If I go to Identity and Color, you can see the primary colors that Duolingo use. Over here, we have the core brand colors, which are like the primary colors. There's secondary colors, and then there's neutrals, which is like the gray. They've even got a color palette for Duo, which is Duolingo's little owl mascot. Something that Duolingo do, as well as other companies, is give their colors distinguishable names, like feather green. These are colors Duolingo has just made up so that it's easy to refer to them. So let's go define quill colors, where we'll set up the color palette we'll be using in our quill project. We'll first look at the primary color. I'll be adding a base color, a tint, and a shade. For the base primary color, I'm choosing this blue. I'm going to call this color Sky Blue, and it's got this hex code. All the tints and shades and all the other colors I'm going to be adding are from OpenColor. So for the tint, I'm going to call it Arctic, and it's got this hex code. For the shade, I'm going to call it Deep Sea, and it has this hex code. Looking at the secondary colors, the base secondary color I'm going to call Lavender with this hex code, and it's this purple color. For the tint, I'm going to call Moonlight Iris with this hex code, which is a lighter version of that purple. And for the shade, I'm going to call it Velvet Night, which has this hex code, and it's a darker version of the purple. I'm going to also introduce a tertiary color. I'm going to call it Pumpkin, which has this hex code, and it's an orange color. The tint I'm going to call Dawn with this hex code, which is a lighter version of this orange. And for the shade, I'm going to call it Lava with this hex code, and this is a darker version of the orange. For my gray color, I'm going to call it Slate, and it looks like this. For the tint, I'm going to call Pebble, which looks like this. And for the shade, I'm going to call Graphite, and it looks like this. So once again, I just got all these colors from OpenColor. I selected a base color and chose a lighter version as my tint and darker version as my shade. Now, of course, you can add more tints and shades, but I want to keep this simple, and right now we have more than enough colors to work with. So let's wrap up by completing the summary card, font family, and color. We looked at the CSS color property, which look like this. And we discussed different color values you can use, like RGB hex, RGBA, and HSL. And I mentioned that hex is by far the most common color value to use. We then defined a color palette. We started with a primary color, where we defined a base color, Sky Blue, a secondary base color, Lavender, a tertiary base color, Pumpkin, and a gray base color, Slate. We then added a tint of each of these, as well as a shade of each of these. And I simply grabbed each of these color values from my favorite tool, OpenColor, where I picked a base color, and one tint and one shade. The guidance we saw was have at least two colors, a primary and a gray, with tints and shades of each. So a moment ago, we defined the color palette for our quill project. So let's now go ahead and apply this color palette for different text elements. So let's now look at our quill homepage and how we add these colors. The primary color is used in our logo, as well as our buttons. We have our secondary color being used as a highlight over here. The gray color is used for paragraph text, and the gray shade is being used for headings. Scrolling down the page, you can see the primary color is being used inside this illustration. We have the tertiary color being used as a highlight. The paragraph is in gray, and our headings are in a gray shade. Scrolling down to the bottom of the page, you can see our primary color is used as a background, and is being used again as the logo in the footer here. The secondary color is being used on the button, and it's being used for this little love heart down here. The gray color is being used for these hyperlinks and small piece of text at the bottom, and the gray shade is being used for the social media icons. Now, although we won't be coding this up in this section, I do want to show you the Quill's journal page. It's the dashboard that will list all our journals. The reason I want to show you this is because it uses other colors we've defined. For example, the background of the emoji is in a blue tint, and the border of each card is in a grey tint. So although we won't be using all the colors for the homepage, a lot of them will come into play later. So let's jump into VS Code and add colors to text where we can. Alright, so I'm back in the app.css file for our Quill project. So let's go add text color where we can. All of our headings use the grey shade, which I called graphite. I add this color by finding the color property and adding the hex value, which from my color palette was hash 212529. And you can see VS Code even gives us a sample of what that color looks like. I'm just going to copy this color for all of my headings. For my paragraph, the color I used was the grey base color, which I called slate, and had the hex code 495057. This same color is used for my anchor tags, so I'll copy it and paste it over here. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see our headings have this nice shade of grey, whereas paragraphs and anchor text are using this base grey color. As this project progresses, and we learn more about the box model and different selectors, we will start adding in our primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. In the final chapter, we'll consolidate all the properties we've looked at by starting to build a style guide. So throughout this topic, we've looked at a lot of different text properties. I'd like to specifically look at the properties we're using inside our Quill project. For styling, we're using font weight. For spacing, we're using line height and letter spacing. For family, font family. For color, color. And for size, font size. Now for each of these properties, in many cases we've defined a whole range of values we're using in our project. The problem is we don't have one place where all these properties and values are listed, for easy use as the project expands. Looking back at the Quill project in our app.css file, you can see our values are defined on different elements. But what we do need is a central location which just lists all the properties and values we've defined. For example, we've only set a handful of colors so far. We haven't even used our primary, secondary, or tertiary colors. So eventually, when we do need them, we should have them in a place that's easy to reach and not in some file at the back of a drawer. Now, many companies will have brand guidelines. In the previous chapter, we looked at Duolingo's brand guidelines. Just to show you another example, I have open here Slack's brand guidelines. Slack is a workplace messaging tool. Now you can see it's very detailed. It's 50 pages long and covers items like brand values, persona, voice and tone, as well as important design elements like how to use their logo, color guidance, typography, and more. In the web design section of the bootcamp, we'll be developing our own brand guidelines for the Quill project. But for now, what we need is a place just to list all our values and properties. So we're going to add this all at the top of our CSS file. I'm going to come to the top here and make some space. The first thing I'm going to do is add a comment in CSS. Like with HTML, the shortcut for this on a Mac is Command/, and on a PC, Control/. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Command/ on my Mac. And this is the syntax for a CSS comment. It starts with /* and ends with */. Just like an HTML comment, this won't appear anywhere in the browser, and is used internally for documentation and notes to self. I'm going to create a multi-line comment by just hitting enter a couple times. For now, I'm going to be adding two main categories of properties. The first is typography. I like to make main headings look like this. I add a few hyphens, put my heading all in caps, typography, and then end it with the same number of hyphens. The other main category we'll be adding is colors. So let's go through all the properties and values one by one and add them up here. On the right, I've selected slides from the last few chapters where I've listed the property and values we're using. Starting with font sizes, I'm going to add a heading all in caps like this. To keep this concise, I'm going to add all the font sizes on a single line separated by a /. The first value is 12 pixels, then 16 pixels, 20 pixels, 24 pixels, 32 pixels, 40 pixels, 48 pixels, and 62 pixels. The next property are different font weights. We're using 400 and 700. Next up, it's line heights. The values we've defined are 1.2 and 1.5. Next, it's letter spacing, and the values we have are 0 and -2 pixels. I'm putting 0 here as a value because this is just the default value. On an element like a paragraph, we're not adding any letter spacing, so this will just have the default value for letter spacing, which is 0. The final typography value is font family, and in our project we're using Poppins. Alright, moving on to colors. I'm going to now add our primary, secondary, tertiary, and gray colors. Starting with the primary. Our base primary color has a hex code of 339AF0, and we call this sky blue. Our primary tint has a hex code of D0EBFF, and we call this Arctic. And our primary shade has a hex code of 1C7ED6, and we call this Deep Sea. Now, to avoid boring you, I'm just going to go add the base tint and shades for our secondary, tertiary, and gray colors. Alright, you can see that they're in now. So what we've now ended up with is an easy to reach central location which has important properties and values that we can pull from anytime as the project expands. At the moment, we just have typography and colors. And as we move through the CSS section, we will be adding other headings containing more properties and values. You're smashing it. We've now finished CSS text. It's now time to learn about CSS selectors. In this topic, we'll cover essential CSS selectors like type, ID, class, and pseudo-classes, along with more advanced concepts such as specificity and inheritance, giving you complete control over how elements are targeted and styled. Let's begin by learning how to style elements directly based on their HTML tag with the type selector. We'll be discussing CSS selectors and the type selector. So let's start off by taking a broad look at CSS selectors. As we know by now, selectors allow us to select HTML elements to apply CSS rules. For example, on this H1, we're applying a font size and color. The H1 is the selector. This is the only type of selector we've seen so far in this course. But there are in fact a range of CSS selectors. There is a large range of CSS selectors that allow us to apply styles from broad styling to specific visual details. I've broken this down into 4 categories. The first are basic selectors. These include element selectors and things like IDs and classes, which we'll be talking about soon. Basic selectors are used a lot. They are the most common type of selector used. Next up, we have combinator selectors. This is where the selector is defined by combining 2 different types of selectors. We'll also be looking at this selector later on. Next up are pseudo-class selectors. These type of selectors apply when a different state or condition is met. For example, hovering over an anchor tag. They're really important and we will be discussing them soon. The last type of selector is a pseudo-element selector. These selectors can target a specific part of an element. As you can see, there's a wide range of different selectors, and we'll be going through each of them in great detail in this topic. Let's look at the most basic type of selector, the type selector, otherwise known as the element selector. The type selector selects elements based on their tag name. It's the selector we've been using so far. We target a specific HTML element like an H1. This is called the type selector. Let's now take a look at some type selector guidance. The type selector is useful for setting global styles to ensure consistency. The word global just means applies everywhere. For example, these are 2 different pages from the same web application. If we look at the main heading on the left here, this is an H1, and it's styled a specific way. If we look on the right, this H1 is also styled the exact same way. So the CSS styling is defined on the H1 using the type selector. We can see the same thing for the paragraph text. That has specific styling like color and line height. And the paragraph on the right also has these exact same styles. Finally, the button over here, which is an anchor tag, has specific styling, like a navy blue background color and rounded corners. And the button on the other page also has these same rules applied to it. So you can see that the type selector is particularly useful for setting global styles on elements which can be used throughout the project. Jumping into our Quill application, on the app.css file, we've in fact already done this. For example, the styling on our H3, which is used in several places on the homepage, is defined once, using the type selector. We've given it specific values for font weight, line height, letter spacing, etc. And if we check out this element in the browser, we'll see that it has consistent styling. The H3 is used down here for our different features. We have an H3 over here and an H3 over here. And you can see the styling is consistent because it's defined once on the H3 using the type selector. We can see the same thing for our paragraph. All the paragraphs on the homepage all look the same, with the same font weight, line height, color, etc. So the type selector is really useful for defining global styles on different HTML elements. And just remember, when we start adding more pages to the application, the same styles applied on our type selector will also apply on those new pages. So let's wrap up and start building the next summary card, basic selectors and the cascade. We looked at the type selector. The type selector selected an HTML element, like an H1. This is an example of the type selector. And in the guidance, we saw it was used for setting global styles. Next, we'll explore how CSS rules are applied and prioritized as a concept known as the cascade. We'll be discussing style priority and style sheet priority. So what is the cascade? The word cascade means flows from one stage to the next. When I grew up in Australia, I'd often go bushwalking, and there'd be a river system called a cascade, where pools of water would flow from one to the other. In the context of CSS, the cascade is about how styles declared later will take priority. Let's have a look at an example. In this piece of code, we're selecting the H1 twice. In the first declaration block, we're giving the H1 a color of blue. And in the second one, we're giving the H1 a color of green. This is what is known as conflicting selectors. Because of the cascade, the later style will take priority. So in this case, green overrides blue, and the H1 will appear as green on the web page. Let's take a look at this inside VS Code. I'm on the app.css file for our Quill project. In this declaration block, I've defined styles for my H1. I'm going to go and select the H1 again, and let's go add the same properties but with different values now. I'll give it a font size of 100 pixels, which is significantly larger than 62. And I'm going to give it the color of red, which is very different to the gray shade we defined here. So let's check this out in the browser. So look what's happened. Our H1 now is the color red with a font size of 100 pixels. These styles are overriding the styles here, specifically the color and the font size. All the other properties are still retained from the first declaration block. For example, the font weight is still 700, the letter spacing is still -2 pixels, etc. So the idea of the cascade is really important. You need to appreciate that a style sheet is kind of dynamic, where styles targeting the same element that are applied later will override those that are applied earlier. Now at this stage, it may not seem so obvious why we'd declare a second H1. It would make more sense just to define all your styles inside your first H1. Now doing this isn't so typical, but we're going to see soon how we can take advantage of the cascade to write more efficient CSS. Now, not only do styles declared later take priority, but also style sheets declared later will take priority. For example, let's say we had an index.html file, and we have these two style sheets, app.css and app2.css. In app.css, we have the CSS rule H1 has a font size of 12 pixels, and in app2.css, we have an H1 with a font size of 52 pixels. So because app2.css is declared after app.css, the font size 52 pixels overrides 12 pixels from the previous style sheet. Let's look at this in action inside VS Code. Okay, I'm first just going to remove this H1. We don't need it anymore. I'm then going to go add a new tab. On my Mac, I'm hitting Command N. I'll select a language, CSS, and I'll straight away save this inside our Quill directory as app2.css. I'm now going to head over to index.html and add this style sheet after our first one. I'll grab the link tag and set the href value to app2.css. So as you can see, our app2.css is defined after our app.css. So whatever styles we define in this style sheet that conflict with the first style sheet will override them. This time, let's target the H2 element. We'll give it a color of green, a font size of 10 pixels, so significantly smaller, and let's also give it a letter spacing of 4 pixels. All right, let's check this out in the browser. So you can see our H2 down here. It's now green, has a much smaller font size, and the letters are more spread out. And as we've discussed, this is occurring because the styles in our second style sheet are overriding the first style sheet. And again, just to reiterate, the order here is really important. Because our app2.css is a later style sheet, styles declared here will take priority. I'm just going to go remove this file and delete it, and remove the link tag, because we don't need it moving forward. Now again, you may be thinking, when am I going to need a second style sheet? Why wouldn't I just define everything in my first style sheet? As we move through this CSS topic, the need for a second style sheet will become apparent, as we're going to start to compartmentalize our different styles, such as global styles, component styles, and then also styles for different screen sizes. So appreciating the fact that later style sheets take priority is going to be important. So let's finish off by adding to our summary card, basic selectors and the cascade. We looked at the cascade. We saw that when we have the same selector, both targeting the same property, is known as conflicting styles. And conflicting styles declared later take priority. So in this case, the color green will be applied to the H1. We also saw what happened when we had two different style sheets, which both have the same selector. We have app.css, targeting an H1 of a font size of 12 pixels, and app2.css, which targets an H1 to have a font size of 52 pixels. In this case, we saw that style sheets defined later take priority. So in this case, the font size of the H1 will be 52 pixels, because conflicting styles in later style sheets take priority. Now we'll see how to apply styles to multiple elements at once by grouping selectors. We'll be discussing grouping shared styles, and grouping selectors and cascading. So what is grouping selectors about? Selectors can be comma-separated to apply shared styles. For example, let's say we had an H1 with the color blue and an H2 with the color blue. We can rewrite this CSS more efficiently like this. We grab the H1 selector and the H2 selector, and we comma-separate them. And then we just define our rule once. This method avoids us repeating shared styles and makes our CSS code more concise. So let's jump into VS Code and see how this works. So I've gone ahead and set up a new directory called grouping. Inside it, I have an index.html file where I've grabbed the boilerplate and added 3 headings, an H1, H2, and H3. I've then linked a style sheet called app.css, which is currently empty. So let's go and grab the H1. We'll give it a color of blue, a font weight of 700, letter spacing of -2 pixels, and font size of 40 pixels. I'm then just going to copy this, change the H1 to an H2, copy it again, and change the H2 to an H3. So we're effectively applying the same 4 rules to the H1, H2, and H3 separately. Let's check this out in the browser. Alright, so as you'd expect, these same rules have been applied to our H1, H2, and H3. As we saw before, we can more efficiently write this as H1, H2, H3, and remove these styles. And refresh the browser, and you'll see there's been no change. So these rules defined once are applying to these 3 different selectors. Now, for most projects you work on, there'll be some styles and are applied to all headings, like font weight and letter spacing. But other styles, like font size, will vary between headings. So how do we deal with that? We want to be able to define shared styles, but we also want to be able to define unique styles for elements that are grouped together. To do this, we're going to be using grouping selectors and cascading. We can use the CSS cascade to add new rules to previous rules. For example, the H1 and H2 here have the same color. The declaration is repeated, but the font size are unique. The H1 has a font size of 62 pixels, and the H2 has a font size of 48 pixels, where we have some shared styles and some unique styles. So this is how we handle it. We group together the shared styles. So here we have H1, H2 with the shared color property. And as a result, the property is defined once. We then add in the unique styling. So first, the H1, which has a font size of 62 pixels. And because of the nature of the cascade, this gray color is added to the H1. And we can do the same thing for the H2. We define the unique value for the font size. And again, because of the nature of the cascade, the gray color is effectively added to this H2. So we're using the cascade to our advantage here. We're adding new rules to previous rules. So the combination of grouping selectors and effectively using the cascade helps us write much cleaner and concise CSS. So let's jump back into VS Code and check this out in action. Alright, so I'm back in the app.css file we were working on before. In most projects, the heading font size is different. So let's remove that from our group styles. We'll add an H1. Let's give it a font size of 50 pixels. We'll add an H2. We'll give that a font size of 40 pixels. And finally the H3, which will give a font size of 30 pixels. I'll save the file and refresh the browser. So now you can see that these shared styles are being applied to our heading 1, 2, and 3, and we're using the cascade to handle the unique nature of the font size for each heading. This technique is very common and very effective for writing cleaner and simpler CSS.
Let's finish off this chapter by adding to our summary card basic selectors and the cascade.
We looked at grouping selectors. We saw that selectors are grouped when there's shared styles, like color for this H1 and H2. We would then add custom styling to our type selectors, like a font size for the H1, where we'd be using the cascade to add new styles to previous ones.
So let's go and add grouping selectors to our Quill project.
I'm inside our app.css of our Quill project. And the first thing I'm going to do is group our headings at the top here as they have a lot of shared styles. I'm then going to go grab all the shared styles between all the headings. Font weight's one of them. Line height. Letter spacing, font family, and color. I'm now going to go delete these shared styles from each heading. So I can remove the font weight, the line height, letter spacing, font family, and color. And what I'm left with is the unique styling rules for the H1. And again, the way this works is we're using the cascade to our advantage, where the H1 will initially have all these styles, and then as we move down the sheet, these styles are added. Now to avoid boring you, I'm just going to go ahead and remove all the shared styles from all the headings. Alright, so let's see what we're left with. We're left with all our shared styles here, and then only a few rules defined on each heading. So all the repetitive properties have been removed, leaving us with much more concise and clean CSS code. I'm going to do the same thing for our paragraph and anchor tags, because there are a few shared styles there as well. The font weight is the same. The line height is the same. The font family is the same. And the color is also the same. So in the paragraph, I can remove those shared styles, and I'm just left with the font size of 20 pixels. In the anchor tag, I'm going to remove the font weight. We're going to keep text decoration because that is unique to the anchor tag. The line height I'll remove because that's shared. Font size is unique to the anchor tag, and these two properties are shared, so I can remove those. So once again, we've cleaned up our code. We have removed repeated styles, and our CSS code is more concise and clean. Now, something you may be wondering is that even within our group selectors for paragraph and anchor tags, and all our headings, there are still shared styles here. For example, the font family is the same in our headings and our paragraph and anchor tags. Essentially, we want to apply the font family to every element.
And soon we will see how we can achieve that,
making our CSS code even more concise.
Moving on, we'll learn how to target specific elements more precisely using ID and class selectors.
We'll be discussing limitations with the type selector, the ID selector, and the class selector. So first up, let's discuss some limitations with type selectors. Sometimes we want to apply specific styles to a single element. For example, let's look at this homepage. You can see the paragraph text here is in white. And in this design, white paragraph text is only used on the hero section. Looking at a section of the page lower down, you can see over here that grey paragraph text is used everywhere else. So simply styling a paragraph grey wouldn't work. We need a method to style a specific element. And to do that, we use the ID selector. The ID selector selects an element based on a unique ID attribute and can only be used once. We've actually met the ID selector already. Back in the HTML section, we learnt about a method called anchor linking, where we put an ID selector on a specific element, and we'd then reference that in a hyperlink, so that when you click the hyperlink, you are taken to that section of the page. Let's now look at an example using the ID attribute in CSS. Let's say we have an index.html page, and we have this body with this paragraph text. You can see here the ID attribute. It has the value red-text. In the app.css file, we would have styles like this, where the color of all paragraphs is grey, but the paragraph with the ID value red text is set to red. The ID selector has this hash symbol in front of the value of the ID attribute in the HTML. So all we do is add an ID attribute to the element we want to target in our HTML, and then reference that value in CSS with the hash symbol followed by the value. Let's play around with this in VS Code. I'm back inside the index.html file for the Quill project we've been working on. I'm going to scroll down to the hero section, and let's go target this paragraph over here. We'll add an ID attribute, and let's make it green, so I'm going to give it the value of green text. Over in app.css, I'm just going to scroll down to the bottom. I'll grab the hash symbol. I'll then reference the ID attribute value, which is green text. Grab our curly brackets, and let's give it the color of green. Let's check this out in the browser. So you can see now that this paragraph is green, whereas all the other paragraphs still remain the grey color. By using the ID attribute, we're only targeting this paragraph here in the hero section. Let's now continue our discussion with limitations of the type selector. Sometimes we want to apply specific styles to multiple elements. So the ID selector can't help us here,
because the ID selector can only be used once on an element.
For example, looking at this page here, you can see that there's grey text on the feature section. Scrolling down on the page, we can see here there's also grey text on the testimonial section. However, in other feature sections, we can see here that white text is used on the feature section. And on this section of the page, we have white text on the hero section. So in multiple places we have grey text, and in multiple places we have white text. So to help with this, we have the class selector. The class selector selects one or more elements based on a class attribute that can be used multiple times. Let's look at an example of this. Looking at the same index.html file we saw before, over here you can see I have the class attribute. I've given it the value blue-text, and I've used it twice. This is what makes the class attribute different to the ID attribute. It can be used multiple times. Having a look now at the app.css file, we select the class attribute with a full stop, or a period. And just like the ID attribute, we then provide the value that was used for the class attribute in our HTML, in this case blue-text. Let's have a play around with this in VS Code. I'm back in the index.html file, and I'm now going to select an element that I want to apply the style to in multiple places. Let's go do it on this h3 that we're using 3 times inside our features section. I'll add a class by typing class and hitting enter, and let's make this text orange, so we'll call it orange-text. I'm then going to copy the class and just paste it in this h3 and this h3. In app.css, to use the class selector, we type full stop or period, and use the value of the class attribute, which we called orange-text. I'll grab our curly brackets, type color, and give it the value of orange. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can now see that our 3 h3s are all orange. We've targeted multiple elements and applied the same style, using the class selector, whereas the ID selector only selected one element. So let's now discuss some selector guidance. Classes are often preferred over IDs because they offer greater flexibility and reusability. Let's have a look at an example. Let's say we had this index.html file, and we had this app.css file, targeting all paragraphs as grey, and then having a class called redText, which makes the text red. Initially in the project, we may just start with one. However, as the project grows, later on we can add another class of redText, so we can easily add styles as the project scales. So because classes can be applied once or multiple times, they offer a lot more flexibility. Let's now look at the next piece of guidance. It is common to use type selectors for global styles and class selectors for more specific visual styles. Taking a look at this page here, this heading would be styled using the type selector. It's a global style, meaning that all H1s throughout the application would be white, with this font size, etc. Whereas for more specific styles, we would use a class selector. For example, this gradient text here could be using the class gradient. So type selectors are useful for global styles, which are used throughout the application, whereas class selectors are useful for styling specific elements or components. So let's jump into Visual Code and check this out. So we've in fact already done this earlier. I created this class called orange-text, and I applied this to the heading 3s on the page. This orange text is essentially overriding the default text applied to all headings, which we can see up here. But we have our grouped headings with this gray color being applied. So this style sets the default base color of all our headings. And then we can create a class like this called orange-text and apply it to specific text elements we want to style. In this case, we added it to the h3 elements. And like in the example we saw just before, we could also style just a portion of text. So let's make a class called popText. Let's give it a color of red. Let's give it a font weight of 900. And let's add some text decoration of red, solid, and underline. Let's apply this popText to the word simplicity over here. I'll head to index.html. To do this, I need to add a span. I'll cut the word simplicity, pop it inside the span, and give this the class popText. Let's refresh the browser. And you can see, once again, this class popText is overriding the default text styling applied to our paragraphs, which we can see over here. We're adding a much thicker font weight of 900 versus 400. The color is being overridden to red, and we're also adding an underline. Now this next piece of guidance is a little bit more tricky, but we will go through it step by step, so just stick with me. Classes for components are designed to be combined on a single HTML element for a more modular approach to styling. Alright, so what does this all mean? First of all, the word components. This is something we're going to be using a lot throughout this course. A component is a piece of reusable UI, or user interface. It's a piece of UI we continue to use throughout the application. So let's take a look at an example of a classic piece of UI. Buttons. Buttons are used throughout the application, on the home page, login page, and within the application itself. Buttons are an example of a component or a piece of reusable UI that is used throughout the application. Now, as you can see here, we actually have 2 different kinds of buttons. We have this green button, which would likely be a primary button, and this white button, which would likely be a secondary button. The colors are different, but the core structure of the button is the same. It has the same rounding. It has the same font size. There's a lot of structural properties here that are the same. So let's now look at the best approach to creating this component in CSS with class selectors. We'd first define a class like this, which sets the button structure. Now, don't worry at all about any of the properties here. The only ones we've covered so far are text decoration and font size. Border radius, padding, and display are properties we're going to look at in the next topic. Just know you need them to create the structure of the button. We would then add this button class to our anchor tag by using the HTML attribute class and giving it the value button btn. This would create the structure of our button. What we would then do is make a new class called button-primary. You can see it has this blue background color and white text. So the aim of this class is it sets a particular button style rule. We would then add this class in addition to the previous class to our anchor tag. So the styles are combined and our class attribute is button btn and button primary. This would then give us our blue button with white text. And again, the structure of the button is from the btn class, whereas the specific styling of the background color and white text is from our btn-primary class. So this all seems a bit confusing just to give us a button. So let's now look at why this method is so powerful. Let's say in our application, like our Quill application, we have a purple button. What we would then do is define a second class, which I'm calling button-secondary. I'm giving it a purple background color and the font color of white. For a hyperlink I want to be a purple button, I would then use this button secondary class. So I'm still referencing the button class to get the structure, but now I'm using the button secondary class to apply the specific styling I want of purple and white. And this would give me a button that looks like this. This method of combining styles like this is incredibly common, and it gives us a modular approach to styling, where we define the structure in one class and then specific styling rules in other classes that we simply add on inside the class attribute.
What we've just seen here is what we'll be implementing in our Quill project.
This is in fact the approach many CSS frameworks like Bootstrap take. A lot of coding bootcamps will teach Bootstrap, but I specifically don't because I find it a bit of a cop-out, and I much prefer you to get a solid understanding of CSS. I'm going to be talking about CSS frameworks like Bootstrap towards the end of the CSS module, but I just wanted to show you that this is exactly how these frameworks do it. If I head over to Docs and scroll down to Components and go to Buttons, you can see that there's this base class, btn, and you can get all these different variants, which are simply added to the base class. For example, button primary, button secondary, etc. The reason I'm not teaching Bootstrap is because we in fact are going to be building our own mini Bootstrap. We're going to be writing our CSS using this modular approach. Don't worry about Bootstrap right now, I just wanted to show you that this method of combining classes like this is incredibly popular and is foundational to a lot of CSS frameworks. Long story short, I'm teaching you CSS properly and not distracting you with these frameworks, which are helpful, but only once you understand the foundations of CSS.
So let's wrap up by finishing the summary card, basic selectors, and the cascade.
We looked at ID and class selectors. Inside the HTML, we can add the ID attribute, like ID red text, and the class attribute, like blue text. In CSS, we select the ID selector, like this, where we use the hash symbol followed by the same ID text used in the HTML attribute. And this would apply the color red to the text copper mug. And we saw that the ID attribute can only be used once. For the class selector, it looks like this, where we use a full stop or period followed by the value that's used in the HTML attribute. In this case, on the text biodiesel tattooed and coloring book. We saw that the class selector can be used multiple times. And because of this, it's more commonly used, as it allows our project to scale when we want to apply the same style across different HTML elements in the project.
So let's go ahead and apply some of the class guidance we just covered earlier.
So I'm starting off in our app.css file. I'm then going to create a new class with a full stop or period and call it small-text. I want to give it a font size of 12 pixels. Now the small text also has the same properties as the paragraph and anchor tag. A font weight of 400, line height of 1.5, Poppins family, and this grey color. So I'm just going to go group it up here as well. I'm going to type comma, and then add the class small text. So in summary, I've created a small text class, which has a font size of 12 pixels, and also shares the same styles with our paragraph and anchor tags. I now want to go add this class inside our HTML. I'll pop our CSS on the right here, so we can see the HTML on the left. I'm going to scroll down to the button, and inside this paragraph here, I'm going to add the class small text. So this text, made with love in London, will now be 12 pixels. So let's check this out in the browser. So if I scroll down to the bottom of the page, you can see this text, made with love in London, is now a lot smaller. It's 12 pixels. Let's start creating our button components. I'm going to create a new class called BTN. And like we saw earlier, this will be the structure of the button. There's only so much we can do for now, as we need to learn a little bit more about the box model in the next topic to fully flesh out this button. But let's start adding the text properties we can. We'll give it a font weight of 400. The font family will be Poppins, with a backup of sans serif. We'll give it a font size of 16 pixels. And because this is used on an anchor tag, we're going to give it text decoration none. Let's now add the styles for the primary and secondary button. I'm going to define a new class, btn-primary, and we're going to give it our primary color, which I can easily grab from up the top here, the sky blue base primary color. We'll create the button secondary, btn-secondary, grab our curly brackets, grab the color property, and grab the base secondary color, which we called lavender. Now in the actual design, the font color is actually white, and the background color are these colors. We will update that a bit later, when we talk more about the CSX box model in the next topic. But for now this is good, because we've set up a good modular structure using classes. So next up, let's go and apply these classes inside our HTML.
So I need to apply the primary button in a few locations. The first is in the register anchor tag. So I'll grab class, I'll type btn to grab the button structure, and then btn primary to grab the specific styling for the primary button. This same primary button is also used on the get started anchor link in the hero section. So I'll copy this class and paste it over here. We're then going to apply our secondary button in the call to action section on this hyperlink over here. So again, I'll grab the class attributes, I'll type btn to get the button structure, and then for the secondary button, to apply that style, we type btn-secondary. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see nothing crazy has happened. All we have so far is the register and get started hyperlink in blue, and at the bottom of the page, in the call to action section, the get started hyperlink over here has purple text. We'll be adding in different styling to our button structure, like padding, etc., to make these hyperlinks look a lot more like buttons.
Now, you may be wondering, why didn't I just get rid of this anchor tag? If I'm going to be applying the BTN style to all our buttons, what's the point of still having this? Well, at the bottom of the page, we have these links here, home, login, and register. And these aren't styled like buttons. They're just navigation text, so we still need to keep this anchor style for navigation items like this. Whereas all the other anchor tags on our homepage, like get started here, learn more and get started, and login and register, will be styled like buttons. So we'll be using these styles here. But at the end of the day, we are still applying them to an anchor tag, which is why we need properties like text decoration none, and font size 16 pixels, which we decided in our style guide would be applied to anchor tags. So in a nutshell, these classes are styling anchor tags, which will look like buttons, and this type element is also styling an anchor tag.
Now in theory, all these styles are actually defined in our CSS, because at the end of the day, the button class is being applied to an anchor tag. If we look at our anchor tag styling, we have text decoration none, font size 16 pixels, font size 16 pixels, and then up the top in our group selectors for our anchor tag, font weight 400, and font family Poppins and sans serif, which are these two over here. So at